Man and Superman by George Bernard Shaw. Act I. Roebuck Ramsden is in his study, opening the morning letters. The study, handsomely and solidly furnished, proclaims the man of means. Not a speck of dust is visible. It is clear that there are at least 2 housemaids and a parlor maid downstairs, and a housekeeper upstairs who does not let them spare elbow grease. Even the top of Roebuck's head is polished. On a sunshiny day, he could heliograph his orders to distant camps by merely nodding. In no other respect, however, does he suggest the military man. It is in active civil life that men get his broad air of importance, his dignified expectation of deference, his determinate mouth disarmed and refined since the hour of his success by the withdrawal of opposition and the concession of comfort and precedence and power. He is more than a highly respectable man. He is marked out as a president of highly respectable men, a chairman among directors, an alderman among councillors, a mayor among aldermen. 4 tufts of iron-gray hair, which will soon be as white as isinglass, and are in other respects not at all unlike it, grow in 2 symmetrical pairs above his ears and at the angles of his spreading jaws. He wears a black frock coat, a white waistcoat, it is bright spring weather, and trousers, neither black nor perceptibly blue, of one of those indefinitely mixed hues, which the modern clothier has produced to harmonize with the religions of respectable men. He has not been out of doors yet today, so he still wears his slippers, his boots being ready for him on the hearthrug. Surmising that he has no valet, and seeing that he has no secretary with a shorthand notebook and a typewriter, one meditates on how little our great Burgess domesticity has been disturbed by new fashions and methods, all by the enterprise of the railway and hotel companies, which sell you a Saturday to Monday of life at Folkestone as a real gentleman for 2 guineas, first-class fares both ways included. How old is Roebuck? The question is important on the threshold of a drama of ideas, for under such circumstances, everything depends on whether his adolescence belonged to the 60s or to the 80s. He was born, as a matter of fact, in 1839, and was a Unitarian and free trader from his boyhood, and an evolutionist from the publication of The Origin of Species. Consequently, he has always classed himself as an advanced thinker and fearlessly outspoken reformer. Sitting at his writing table, he has on his right the windows giving on Portland Place. Through these, as through a proscenium, the curious spectator may contemplate his profile as well as the blinds will permit. On his left is the inner wall, with a stately bookcase and the door not quite in the middle, but somewhat further from him. Against the wall opposite him are 2 busts on pillars, one to his left of John Bright, the other to his right of Mr. Herbert Spencer. Between them hang an engraved portrait of Richard Cobden, enlarged photographs of Martineau, Huxley, and George Eliot, autotypes of allegories by Mr. G. F. Watts, for Roebuck believes in the fine arts with all the earnestness of a man who does not understand them, and an impression of Dupont's engraving of Delaroche's Beaux-Arts hemicycle, representing the great men of all ages. On the wall behind him, above the mantel shelf, is a family portrait of impenetrable obscurity. A chair stands near the writing table for the convenience of business visitors. 2 other chairs are against the wall between the busts, and notes the part played in evolution by the voluptuary will be the same as that already played by the glutton. The glutton, as the man with the strongest motive for nourishing himself, will always take more pains than his fellows to get food. When food is so difficult to get that only great exertions can secure a sufficient supply of it, the glutton's appetite develops his cunning and enterprise to the utmost, and he becomes not only the best fed but the ablest man in the community. But in more hospitable climates, or where the social organization of the food supply makes it easy for a man to overeat, then the glutton eats himself out of health and finally out of existence. All other voluptuaries prosper and perish in the same way, and this is why the survival of the fittest means finally the survival of the self-controlled, because they alone can adapt themselves to the perpetual shifting of conditions produced by industrial progress. Right? Man and Superman, a comedy and a philosophy. Imprint this ebook is the product of many hours of hard work by volunteers for Standard eBooks, and builds on the hard work of other literature lovers made possible by the public domain. This particular ebook is based on transcriptions from Project Gutenberg and Bartleby, and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The source text and artwork in this ebook are believed to be in the United States public domain. That is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. They may still be copyrighted in other countries, so users located outside of the United States must check their local laws before using this ebook. The creators of and contributors to this ebook dedicate their contributions to the worldwide public domain via the terms in the CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication. For full license information, see the uncopyright at the end of this ebook. Standard eBooks is a volunteer-driven project that produces ebook editions of public domain literature using modern typography, technology, and editorial standards, and distributes them free of cost. You can download this and other ebooks carefully produced for true book lovers at Standard Books.org. List of illustrations: 8 bars of musical notation for 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. 4 bars of musical notation for a flute, 2 horns, and a bassoon. 2 bars of a descending melody. Man and Superman by George Bernard Shaw. Uncopyright. May you do good and not evil. May you find forgiveness for yourself and forgive others. May you share freely, never taking more than you give. Copyright pages exist to tell you that you can't do something. Unlike them, this uncopyright page exists to tell you that the writing and artwork in this ebook are believed to be in the United States public domain. That is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. The United States public domain represents our collective cultural heritage, and items in it are free for anyone in the United States to do almost anything at all with, without having to get permission. Copyright laws are different all over the world, and the source text or artwork in this ebook may still be copyrighted in other countries. If you're not located in the United States, you must check your local laws before using this ebook. Standard eBooks makes no representations regarding the copyright status of the source text or artwork in this ebook in any country other than the United States. Non-authorship activities performed on items that are in the public domain, so-called sweat of the brow work, don't create a new copyright. That means that nobody can claim a new copyright on an item that is in the public domain for, among other things, work like digitization, mock-up, or typography. Regardless, the contributors to this ebook release their contributions under the terms in the CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication, thus dedicating to the worldwide public domain all of the work they've done on this ebook, including but not limited to metadata, the title page, imprint, colophon, this uncopyright, and any changes or enhancements to, or mock-up on, the original text and artwork. This dedication doesn't change the copyright status of the source text or artwork. We make this dedication in the interest of enriching our global cultural heritage, to promote free and libre culture around the world, and to give back to the unrestricted culture that has given all of us so much. Table of Contents. Landmarks. Act Roman 2. On the carriage drive in the park of a country house near Richmond, a motor car has broken down. It stands in front of a clump of trees round which the drive sweeps to the house, which is partly visible through them. Indeed, Tanner, standing in the drive with the car on his right hand, could get an unobstructed view of the west corner of the house on his left, were he not far too much interested in a pair of supine legs in blue serge trousers which protrude from beneath the machine. He is watching them intently with bent back and hands supported on his knees. His leathern overcoat and peaked cap proclaim him one of the dismounted passengers. Act Roman 3. Evening in the Sierra Nevada. Rolling slopes of brown, with olive trees instead of apple trees in the cultivated patches, and occasional prickly pears instead of goss and bracken in the wilds. Higher up, tall stone peaks and precipices, all handsome and distinguished. No wild nature here, rather a most aristocratic mountain landscape made by a fastidious artist-creator. No vulgar profusion of vegetation, even a touch of aridity in the frequent patches of stones, Spanish magnificence and Spanish economy everywhere. Not very far north of a spot at which the high road over one of the passes crosses a tunnel on the railway from Malaga to Granada, is one of the mountain amphitheaters of the Sierra. Looking at it from the wide end of the horseshoe, one sees, a little to the right, in the face of the cliff, a romantic cave which is really an abandoned quarry, and towards the left a little hill, commanding a view of the road, which skirts the amphitheater on the left, maintaining its higher level on embankments and on an occasional stone arch. On the hill, watching the road, is a man who is either a Spaniard or a Scotchman. Probably a Spaniard, since he wears the dress of a Spanish goatherd and seems at home in the Sierra Nevada, but very like a Scotchman for all that. In the hollow, on the slope leading to the quarry cave, are about a dozen men who, as they recline at their cave round a heap of smoldering white ashes of dead leaf and brushwood, have an air of being conscious of themselves as picturesque scoundrels honoring the Sierra by using it as an effective pictorial background. As a matter of artistic fact, they are not picturesque, and the mountains tolerate them as lions tolerate lice. An English policeman or poor law guardian would recognize them as a selected band of tramps and able-bodied paupers. This description of them is not wholly contemptuous. Whoever has intelligently observed the tramp or visited the able-bodied ward of a workhouse will admit that our social failures are not all drunkards and weaklings. Some of them are men who do not fit the class they were born into. Precisely the same qualities that make the educated gentleman an artist may make an uneducated manual laborer an able-bodied pauper. There are men who fall helplessly into the workhouse because they are good for nothing. But there are also men who are there because they are strong-minded enough to disregard the social convention, obviously not a disinterested one on the part of the ratepayer, which bids a man live by heavy and badly paid drudgery when he has the alternative of walking into the workhouse, announcing himself as a destitute person, and legally compelling the guardians to feed, clothe, and house him better than he could feed, clothe, and house himself without great exertion. When a man who is born a poet refuses a stool in a stockbroker's office, and starves in a garret, sponging on a poor landlady or on his friends and relatives rather than work against his grain, or when a lady, because she is a lady, will face any extremity of parasitic dependence rather than take a situation as cook or parlour-maid, we make large allowances for them. To such allowances, the able-bodied pauper and his nomadic variant the tramp are equally entitled. Further, the imaginative man, if his life is to be tolerable to him, must have leisure to tell himself stories, and a position which lends itself to imaginative decoration. The ranks of unskilled labor offer no such positions. We misuse our laborers horribly, and when a man refuses to be misused, we have no right to say that he is refusing honest work. Let us be frank in this matter before we go on with our play, so that we may enjoy it without hypocrisy. If we were reasoning, far-sighted people, 4/5 of us would go straight to the guardians for relief, and knock the whole social system to pieces with most beneficial reconstructive results. The reason we do this is because we work like bees or ants, by instinct or habit, not reasoning about the matter at all. Therefore, when a man comes along who can and does reason, and who, applying the Kantian test to his conduct, can truly say to us, if everybody did as I do, the world would be compelled to reform itself industrially, and abolish slavery and squalor, which exist only because everybody does as you do, let us honor that man and seriously consider the advisability of following his example. Such a man is the able-bodied, able-minded pauper. Were he a gentleman doing his best to get a pension or a sinecure instead of sweeping a crossing, nobody would blame him for deciding that so long as the alternative lies between living mainly at the expense of the community and allowing the community to live mainly at his, it would be folly to accept what is to him personally the greater of the two evils. We may therefore contemplate the tramps of the Sierra without prejudice, admitting cheerfully that our objects, briefly, to be gentlemen of fortune, are much the same as theirs, and the difference in our position and methods merely accidental. One or two of them, perhaps, it would be wiser to kill without malice in a friendly and frank manner, for there are bipeds, just as there are quadrupeds, who are too dangerous to be left unchained and unmuzzled, and these cannot fairly expect to have other men's lives wasted in the work of watching them. But as society has not the courage to kill them, and when it catches them, simply wreaks on them some superstitious expiatory rites of torture and degradation, and then lets them loose with heightened qualifications for mischief, it is just as well that they are at large in the Sierra, and in the hands of a chief who looks as if he might possibly, on provocation, order them to be shot. This chief, seated in the center of the group on a squared block of stone from the quarry, is a tall, strong man, with a striking cockatoo nose, glossy black hair, pointed beard, upturned mustache, and a Mephistophelian affectation which is fairly imposing, perhaps because the scenery admits of a larger swagger than Piccadilly, perhaps because of a certain sentimentality in the man which gives him that touch of grace which alone can excuse deliberate picturesqueness. His eyes and mouth are by no means rascally. He has a fine voice and a ready wit, and whether he is really the strongest man in the party or not, he looks it. He is certainly the best fed, the best dressed, and the best trained. The fact that he speaks English is not unexpected in spite of the Spanish landscape. For with the exception of one man who might be guessed as a bullfighter ruined by drink and one unmistakable Frenchman, they are all Cockney or American. Therefore, in a land of cloaks and sombreros, they mostly wear seedy overcoats, woolen mufflers, hard hemispherical hats, and dirty brown gloves. Only a very few dress after their leader, whose broad sombrero, with a cock's feather in the band, and voluminous cloak descending to his high boots, are as un-English as possible. None of them are armed, and the ungloved ones keep their hands in their pockets, because it is their national belief that it must be dangerously cold in the open air with the night coming on. It is as warm an evening as any reasonable man could desire. Except the bullfighting inebriate, there is only one person in the company who looks more than, say, 33. He is a small man with reddish whiskers, weak eyes, and the anxious look of a small tradesman in difficulties. He wears the only tall hat visible. It shines in the sunset with the sticky glow of some sixpenny patent hat reviver, often applied and constantly tending to produce a worse state of the original surface than the ruin it was applied to remedy. He has a collar and cuff of celluloid, and his brown Chesterfield overcoat, with velvet collar, is still presentable. He is preeminently the respectable man of the party, and is certainly over 40, possibly over 50. He is the corner man on the leader's right, opposite 3 men in scarlet ties on his left. One of these 3 is the Frenchman. Of the remaining 2, who are both English, one is argumentative, solemn, and obstinate, the other rowdy and mischievous. To Tanner, becoming more confidential as he finds himself virtually alone with a sympathetic listener in the still starlight of the mountains, for all the rest are asleep by this time. It was just so with her, sir. Her intellect reached forward into the 20th century. Her social prejudices and family affections reached back into the dark ages. Ah, sir, how the words of Shakespeare seem to fit every crisis in our emotions. I loved Louisa. 40,000 brothers could not with all their quantity of love make up my sum. And so on. I forget the rest. Call it madness if you will, infatuation. I am an able man, a strong man. In 10 years I should have owned a first-class hotel. I met her, and you see? I am a brigand, an outcast. Even Shakespeare cannot do justice to what I feel for Louisa. Let me read you some lines that I have written about her myself. However slight their literary merit may be, they express what I feel better than any casual words can. He produces a packet of hotel bills scrawled with manuscript and kneels at the fire to decipher them, poking it with a stick to make it glow. Perhaps you do not care for that one. I think you will like this better. He recites in rich, soft tones and to slow time. Louisa, I love thee. I love thee, Louisa. Louisa, 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 I love thee. One name and one phrase make my music, Louisa. Louisa, 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 I love thee. Mendoza thy lover, Mendoza, Mendoza adoringly lives for Louisa. There's nothing but that in the world for Mendoza. Louisa, Louisa, Mendoza adores thee, affected. There is no merit in producing beautiful lines upon such a name. Louisa is an exquisite name, is it not? Oh, wert thou, Louisa, the wife of Mendoza, Mendoza's Louisa, Louisa Mendoza, how blessed were the life of Louisa's Mendoza, how painless his longing of love for Louisa. That is real poetry from the heart of hearts. Don't you think it will move her? No answer. Resignedly. Asleep, as usual. Doggerel to all the world. Heavenly music to me. Idiot that I am to wear my heart on my sleeve. He composes himself to sleep, murmuring, Louisa, I love thee, Louisa, 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 Louisa. I of course not, but are you sure he would be uncomfortable? Of course you know best. You brought him here originally, and we had the greatest hopes of him. His sentiments were in the best taste of our best people. You remember how he sang? He begins to sing in a nasal operatic baritone, tremulous from an eternity of misuse in the French manner. Vivin la femine, viver il buon vino, taking up the tune an octave higher in his countertenor. Sostegno a gloria d'umanita. Act Roman for the garden of a villa in Granada. Whoever wishes to know what it is like must go to Granada and see. One may prosaically specify a group of hills dotted with villas, the Alhambra on the top of one of the hills, and a considerable town in the valley, approached by dusty white roads in which the children, no matter what they are doing or thinking about, automatically whine for halfpence and reach out little clutching brown palms for them. But there is nothing in this description, except the Alhambra, the begging, and the color of the roads, that does not fit Surrey as well as Spain. The difference is that the Surrey hills are comparatively small and ugly, and should properly be called the Surrey protuberances. but these Spanish hills are of mountain stock. The amenity which conceals their size does not compromise their dignity. This particular garden is on a hill opposite the Alhambra, and the villa is as expensive and pretentious as a villa must be if it is to be let furnished by the week to opulent American and English visitors. If we stand on the lawn at the foot of the garden and look uphill, our horizon is the stone balustrade of a flagged platform on the edge of infinite space at the top of the hill. Between us and this platform is a flower garden with a circular basin and fountain in the center, surrounded by geometrical flower beds, gravel paths, and clipped yew trees in the genteelest order. The garden is higher than our lawn, so we reach it by a few steps in the middle of its embankment. The platform is higher again than the garden, from which we mount a couple moss steps to look over the balustrade at a fine view of the town up the valley and of the hills that stretch away beyond it to where, in the remotest distance, they become mountains. On our left is the villa, accessible by steps from the left-hand corner of the garden. Returning from the platform through the garden and down again to the lawn, a movement which leaves the villa behind us on our right, we find evidence of literary interests on the part of the tenants in the fact that there is no tennis net nor set of croquet hoops, but on our left, a little iron garden table with books on it, mostly yellow-backed, and a chair beside it. A chair on the right has also a couple of open books upon it. There are no newspapers, a circumstance which, with the absence of games, might lead an intelligent spectator to the most far-reaching conclusions as to the sort of people who live in the villa. Such speculations are checked, however, on this delightfully fine afternoon, by the appearance at a little gate in a paling on our left, of Henry Straker in his professional costume. He opens the gate for an elderly gentleman and follows him on to the lawn. This elderly gentleman defies the Spanish sun in a black frock coat, tall silk bat, trousers in which narrow stripes of dark gray and lilac blend into a highly respectable color, and a black necktie tied into a bow over spotless linen. Probably, therefore, a man whose social position needs constant and scrupulous affirmation without regard to climate. One who would dress thus for the middle of the Sahara or the top of Mont Blanc, and since he has not the stamp of the class which accepts as its life mission the advertising and maintenance of first-rate tailoring and millinery, he looks vulgar in his finery, though in a working dress of any kind he would look dignified enough. He is a bullet-cheeked man with a red complexion, stubbly hair, smallish eyes, a hard mouth that folds down at the corners, and a dogged chin. The looseness of skin that comes with age has attacked his throat and the laps of his cheeks, but he is still hard as an apple above the mouth, so that the upper half of his face looks younger than the lower. He has the self-confidence of one who has made money, and something of the truculence of one who has made it in a brutalizing struggle, his civility having under it a perceptible menace that he has other methods in reserve if necessary. Withal, a man to be rather pitied when he is not to be feared, for there is something pathetic about him at times, as if the huge commercial machine which has worked him into his frock coat had allowed him very little of his own way, and left his affections hungry and baffled. At the first word that falls from him, it is clear that he is an Irishman whose native intonation has clung to him through many changes of place and rank. One can only guess that the original material of his speech was perhaps the surly Kerry brogue, but the degradation of speech that occurs in London, Glasgow, Dublin, and big cities generally has been at work on it so long that nobody but an errant cockney would dream of calling it a brogue now, for its music is almost gone, though its surliness is still perceptible. Straker, as a very obvious cockney, inspires him with implacable contempt, as a stupid Englishman who cannot even speak his own language properly. Straker, on the other hand, regards the old gentleman's accent as a joke thoughtfully provided by Providence expressly for the amusement of the British race, and treats him nominally with the indulgence due to an inferior and unlucky species, but occasionally with indignant alarm when the old gentleman shows signs of intending his Irish nonsense to be taken seriously. The Revolutionist's Handbook and Pocket Companion, by John Tanner, MIRC, member of the idle rich class. Preface to the Revolutionist's Handbook. No one can contemplate the present condition of the masses of the people without desiring something like a revolution for the better. Forward, a revolutionist is one who desires to discard the existing social order and try another. The Constitution of England is revolutionary. To a Russian or Anglo-Indian bureaucrat, a general election is as much a revolution as a referendum or plebiscite in which the people fight instead of voting. The French Revolution overthrew one set of rulers and substituted another with different interests and different views. That is what a general election enables the people to do in England every 7 years if they choose. Revolution is therefore a national institution in England, and its advocacy by an Englishman needs no apology. Every man is a revolutionist concerning the thing he understands. For example, every person who has mastered a profession is a skeptic concerning it, and consequently a revolutionist. Every genuinely religious person is a heretic, and therefore a revolutionist. All who achieve real distinction in life begin as revolutionists. The most distinguished persons become more revolutionary as they grow older, though they are commonly supposed to become more conservative owing to their loss of faith in conventional methods of reform. Any person under the age of 30, who, having any knowledge of the existing social order, is not a revolutionist, is an inferior. And yet revolutions have never lightened the burden of tyranny. They have only shifted it to another shoulder. John Tanner, the Revolutionist's Handbook, on Good Breeding, If There Were No God, said the 18th century deist, it would be necessary to invent him. Now this 18th century God was Deus ex machina, the God who helped those who could not help themselves, the God of the lazy and incapable. The 19th century decided that there is indeed no such God, and now man must take in hand all the work that he used to shirk with an idle prayer. He must, in effect, change himself into the political providence which he formerly conceived as God, and such change is not only possible, but the only sort of change that is real. The mere transfiguration of institutions, as from military and priestly dominance to commercial and scientific dominance, from commercial dominance to proletarian democracy, from slavery to serfdom to capitalism, from monarchy to republicanism, from polytheism to monotheism, from monotheism to atheism, from atheism to pantheistic humanitarianism, from general illiteracy to general literacy, from romance to realism to mysticism, from metaphysics to physics, are all but changes from tweedledum to tweedledee. Plus saw change, plus c'est la même chose. But the changes from the crab apple to the pippin, from the wolf and fox to the house dog, from the charger of Henry V to the brewer's draft horse and the race horse, are real. For here man has played the god, subduing nature to his intention, and ennobling or debasing life for a set purpose. And what can be done with a wolf can be done with a man. If such monsters as the tramp and the gentleman can appear as mere byproducts of man's individual greed and folly, what might we not hope for as a main product of his universal aspiration? This is no new conclusion. The despair of institutions and the inexorable, "Ye must be born again," with Mrs. Poyce's stipulation, and born different, recurs in every generation. The cry for the Superman did not begin with Nietzsche, nor will it end with his vogue. But it has always been silenced by the same question. What kind of person is this Superman to be? You ask, not for a super apple, but for an eatable apple, not for a super horse, but for a horse of great a draught or velocity. Neither is it of any use to ask for a Superman. You must furnish a specification of the sort of man you want. Unfortunately, you do not know what sort of man you want. Some sort of good-looking philosopher-athlete, with a handsome, healthy woman for his mate, perhaps. Vague as this is, it is a great advance on the popular demand for a perfect gentleman and a perfect lady. And after all, no market demand in the world takes the form of exact technical specification of the article required. Excellent poultry and potatoes are produced to satisfy the demand of housewives who do not know the technical differences between a tuba and a chicken. They will tell you that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and they are right. The proof of the Superman will be in the living, and we shall find out how to produce him by the old method of trial and error, and not by waiting for a completely convincing prescription of his ingredients. Certain common and obvious mistakes may be ruled out from the beginning. For example, we agree that we want superior mind, but we need not fall into the football club folly of counting on this as a product of superior body. Yet if we recoil so far as to conclude that superior mind consists in being the dupe of our ethical classifications of virtues and vices, in short, of conventional morality, we shall fall out of the frying pan of the football club into the fire of the Sunday school. If we must choose between a race of athletes and a race of good men, let us have the athletes, better Samson and Milo than Calvin and Robespierre. But neither alternative is worth changing for. Samson is no more a Superman than Calvin. What then are we to do? Roman 2 Property and marriage. Let us hurry over the obstacles set up by property and marriage. Revolutionists make too much of them. No doubt it is easy to demonstrate that property will destroy society unless society destroys it. No doubt, also, property has hitherto held its own and destroyed all the empires. But that was because the superficial objection to it, that it distributes social wealth and the social labor burden in a grotesquely inequitable manner, did not threaten the existence of the race, but only the individual happiness of its units, and finally the maintenance of some irrelevant political form or other, such as a nation, an empire, or the like. Now, as happiness never matters to nature, as she neither recognizes flags and frontiers, nor cares a straw whether the economic system adopted by a society is feudal, capitalistic, or collectivist, provided it keeps the race afoot, the hive and the anthill being as acceptable to her as utopia. The demonstrations of socialists, though irrefutable, will never make any serious impression on property. The knell of that overrated institution will not sound until it is felt to conflict with some more vital matter than mere personal inequities in industrial economy. No such conflict was perceived, whilst society had not yet grown beyond national communities too small and simple to overtax man's limited political capacity disastrously. But we have now reached the stage of international organization. Man's political capacity and magnanimity are clearly beaten by the vastness and complexity of the problems forced on him. And it is at this anxious moment that he finds, when he looks upward for a mightier mind to help him, that the heavens are empty. He will presently see that his discarded formula that man is the temple of the Holy Ghost happens to be precisely true, and that it is only through his own brain and hand that this Holy Ghost, formerly the most nebulous person in the Trinity, and now become its sole survivor as it has always been its real unity, can help him in any way. And so, if the Superman is to come, he must be born of woman by man's intentional and well-considered contrivance. Conviction of this will smash everything that opposes it, even property and marriage, which laugh at the laborer's petty complaint that he is defrauded of surplus value, and at the domestic miseries of the slaves of the wedding ring, will themselves be laughed aside as the lightest of trifles, if they cross this conception, when it becomes a fully realized vital purpose of the race. That they must cross, it becomes obvious the moment we acknowledge the futility of breeding men for special qualities, as we breed cocks for game, greyhounds for speed, or sheep for mutton. What is really important in man is the part of him that we do not yet understand. Of much of it we are not even conscious, just as we are not normally conscious of keeping up our circulation by our hot pump, though if we neglect it we die. We are therefore driven to the conclusion that when we have carried selection as far as we can by rejecting from the list of eligible parents all persons who are uninteresting, unpromising, or blemished without any set-off, we shall still have to trust to the guidance of fancy, alias voice of nature, both in the breeders and the parents, for that superiority in the unconscious self, which will be the true characteristic of the Superman. At this point, we perceive the importance of giving fancy the widest possible field. To cut humanity up into small cliques and effectively limit the selection of the individual to his own clique is to postpone the Superman for eons, if not forever. Not only should every person be nourished and trained as a possible parent, but there should be no possibility of such an obstacle to natural selection as the objection of a countess to a navvy or of a duke to a charwoman. Equality is essential to good breeding, and equality, as all economists know, is incompatible with property. Besides, equality is an essential condition of bad breeding also, and bad breeding is indispensable to the weeding out of the human race. When the conception of heredity took hold of the scientific imagination in the middle of last century, its devotees announced that it was a crime to marry the lunatic to the lunatic, or the consumptive to the consumptive. But pray, are we to try to correct our diseased stocks by infecting our healthy stocks with them? Clearly the attraction which disease has for diseased people is beneficial to the race. If two really unhealthy people get married, they will, as likely as not, have a great number of children who will all die before they reach maturity. This is a far more satisfactory arrangement than the tragedy of a union between a healthy and an unhealthy person. Though more costly than sterilization of the unhealthy, it has the enormous advantage that in the event of our notions of health and unhealth being erroneous, which to some extent they most certainly are, the error will be corrected by experience instead of confirmed by evasion. One fact must be faced resolutely, in spite of the shrieks of the romantic. There is no evidence that the best citizens are the offspring of congenial marriages, or that a conflict of temperament is not a highly important part of what breeders call crossing. On the contrary, it is quite sufficiently probable that good results may be obtained from parents who would be extremely unsuitable companions and partners, to make it certain that the experiment of mating them will sooner or later be tried purposely almost as often as it is now tried accidentally. But mating such couples must clearly not involve marrying them. In conjugation, two complementary persons may supply one another's deficiencies. In the domestic partnership of marriage, they only feel them and suffer from them. Thus the son of a robust, cheerful, eupeptic British country squire, with the tastes and range of his class, and of a clever, imaginative, intellectual, highly civilized Jewess, might be very superior to both his parents. But it is not likely that the Jewess would find the squire an interesting companion, or his habits, his friends, his place and mode of life congenial to her. Therefore marriage, whilst it is made an indispensable condition of mating, will delay the advent of the Superman as effectually as property, and will be modified by the impulse towards him just as effectually. The practical abrogation of property and marriage as they exist at present will occur without being much noticed. To the mass of men, the intelligent abolition of property would mean nothing except an increase in the quantity of food, clothing, housing, and comfort at their personal disposal, as well as a greater control over their time and circumstances. Very few persons now make any distinction between virtually complete property and property held on such highly developed public conditions as to place its income on the same footing as that of a propertyless clergyman, officer, or civil servant. A landed proprietor may still drive men and women off his land, demolish their dwellings, and replace them with sheep or deer. And in the unregulated trades, the private trader may still sponge on the regulated trades and sacrifice the life and health of the nation as lawlessly as the Manchester cotton manufacturers did at the beginning of last century. But though the factory code on the one hand and trade union organization on the other have, within the lifetime of men still living, converted the old unrestricted property of the cotton manufacturer in his mill and the cotton spinner in his labor into a mere permission to trade or work on stringent public or collective conditions, imposed in the interest of the general welfare, without any regard for individual hard cases. People in Lancashire still speak of their property in the old terms, meaning nothing more by it than the things a thief can be punished for stealing. The total abolition of property and the conversion of every citizen into a salaried functionary in the public service would leave much more than 99% of the nation quite unconscious of any greater change than now takes place when the son of a shipowner goes into the Navy. They would still call their watches and umbrellas and back gardens their property. Marriage also will persist as a name attached to a general custom long after the custom itself will have altered. For example, modern English marriage, as modified by divorce and by Married Women's Property Acts, differs more from early 19th century marriage than Byron's marriage did from Shakespeare's. At the present moment, marriage in England differs not only from marriage in France, but from marriage in Scotland. Marriage as modified by the divorce laws in South Dakota would be called mere promiscuity in Clapham. Yet the Americans, far from taking a profligate and cynical view of marriage, do homage to its ideals with a seriousness that seems old-fashioned in Clapham. Neither in England nor America would a proposal to abolish marriage be tolerated for a moment. And yet nothing is more certain than that in both countries, the progressive modification of the marriage contract will be continued until it is no more onerous nor irrevocable than any ordinary commercial deed of partnership. Were even this dispensed with, people would still call themselves husbands and wives, describe their companionships as marriages, and be for the most part unconscious that they were any less married than Henry Roman VIII. For though a glance at the legal conditions of marriage in different Christian countries shows that marriage varies legally from frontier to frontier, domesticity varies so little that most people believe their own marriage laws to be universal. Consequently, here again, as in the case of property, the absolute confidence of the public in the stability of the institution's name makes it all the easier to alter its substance. However, it cannot be denied that one of the changes in public opinion demanded by the need for the Superman is a very unexpected one. It is nothing less than the dissolution of the present necessary association of marriage with conjugation, which most unmarried people regard as the very diagnostic of marriage. They are wrong. Of course, it would be quite as near the truth to say that conjugation is the one purely accidental and incidental condition of marriage. Conjugation is essential to nothing but the propagation of the race, and the moment that paramount need is provided for otherwise than by marriage, conjugation, from nature's creative point of view, ceases to be essential in marriage. But marriage does not thereupon cease to be so economical, convenient, and comfortable that the Superman might safely bribe the matrimonimaniacs by offering to revive all the old inhuman stringency and irreversibility of marriage, to abolish divorce, to confirm the horrible bond which still chains decent people to drunkards, criminals, and wasters, provided only the complete extrication of conjugation from it were conceded to him. For if people could form domestic companionships on no easier terms than these, they would still marry. The Roman Catholic, forbidden by his church to avail himself of the divorce laws, marries as freely as the South Dakotan Presbyterians, who can change partners with a facility that scandalizes the old world. And were his church to dare a further step towards Christianity and enjoin celibacy on its laity as well as on its clergy, marriages would still be contracted for the sake of domesticity by perfectly obedient sons and daughters of the Church. One need not further pursue these hypotheses. They are only suggested here to help the reader to analyze marriage into its two functions of regulating conjugation and supplying a form of domesticity. These two functions are quite separable, and domesticity is the only one of the two which is essential to the existence of marriage, because conjugation without domesticity is not marriage at all, whereas domesticity without conjugation is still marriage. In fact, it is necessarily the actual condition of all fertile marriages during a great part of their duration, and of some marriages during the whole of it. Taking it, then, that property and marriage, by destroying equality and thus hampering sexual selection with irrelevant conditions, are hostile to the evolution of the Superman, it is easy to understand why the only generally known modern experiment in breeding the human race took place in a community which discarded both institutions. Roman 3, the perfectionist experiment at Oneida Creek. In 1848, the Oneida community was founded in America to carry out a resolution arrived at by a handful of perfectionist communists, that we will devote ourselves exclusively to the establishment of the kingdom of God. Though the American nation declared that this sort of thing was not to be tolerated in a Christian country, the Oneida community held its own for over 30 years, during which period it seems to have produced healthier children and done and suffered less evil than any joint stock company on record. It was, however, a highly selected community. For a genuine communist, roughly definable as an intensely proud person who proposes to enrich the common fund, instead of to sponge on it, is superior to an ordinary joint stock capitalist, precisely as an ordinary joint stock capitalist is superior to a pirate. Further, the perfectionists were mightily shepherded by their chief Noise, one of those chance attempts at the Superman which occur from time to time, in spite of the interference of man's blundering institutions. The existence of Noise simplified the breeding problem for the communists, the question as to what sort of man they should strive to breed being settled at once by the obvious desirability of breeding another Noise. But an experiment conducted by a handful of people, who, after 30 years of immunity from the unintentional child slaughter that goes on by ignorant parents in private homes, numbered only 300, could do very little except prove that communists, under the guidance of a Superman, devoted exclusively to the establishment of the kingdom of God, and caring no more for property and marriage than a Camberwell minister cares for Hindu caste or sati, might make a much better job of their lives than ordinary folk under the harrow of both these institutions. Yet their Superman himself admitted that this apparent success was only part of the abnormal phenomenon of his own occurrence. For when he came to the end of his powers through age, he himself guided and organized the voluntary relapse of the communists into marriage, capitalism, and customary private life, thus admitting that the real social solution was not what a casual Superman could persuade a picked company to do for him, but what a whole community of Supermen would do spontaneously. If Noise had had to organize, not a few dozen perfectionists, but the whole United States. America would have beaten him as completely as England beat Oliver Cromwell, France Napoleon, or Rome Julius Caesar. Cromwell learnt by bitter experience that God himself cannot raise a people above its own level, and that even though you stir a nation to sacrifice all its appetites to its conscience, the result will still depend wholly on what sort of conscience the nation has got. Napoleon seems to have ended by regarding mankind as a troublesome pack of hounds, only worth keeping for the spot of hunting with them. Caesar's capacity for fighting without hatred or resentment was defeated by the determination of his soldiers to kill their enemies in the field, instead of taking them prisoners to be spared by Caesar, and his civil supremacy was purchased by colossal bribery of the citizens of Rome. What great rulers cannot do, codes and religions cannot do. Man reads his own nature into every ordinance. If you devise a superhuman commandment so cunningly that it cannot be misinterpreted in terms of his will, he will denounce it as seditious blasphemy, or else disregard it as either crazy or totally unintelligible. Parliaments and synods may tinker as much as they please with their codes and creeds as circumstances alter the balance of classes and their interests. And, as a result of the tinkering, there may be an occasional illusion of moral evolution, as when the victory of the commercial caste over the military caste leads to the substitution of social boycotting and pecuniary damages for dueling. At certain moments, there may even be a considerable material advance, as when the conquest of political power by the working class produces a better distribution of wealth through the simple action of the selfishness of the new masters. But all this is mere readjustment and reformation. Until the heart and mind of the people is changed, the very greatest man will no more dare to govern on the assumption that all are as great as he than a drover dare leave his flock to find its way through the streets as he himself would. Until there is an England in which every man is a Cromwell, a France in which every man is a Napoleon, a Rome in which every man is a Caesar, a Germany in which every man is a Luther plus a Goethe, the world will be no more improved by its heroes than a Brixton Villa is improved by the Pyramid of Cheops. The production of such nations is the only real change possible to us. Roman 4, man's objection to his own improvement, but would such a change be tolerated if man must rise above himself to desire it? It would, through his misconception of its nature. Man does desire an ideal Superman with such energy as he can spare from his nutrition, and has in every age magnified the best living substitute for it he can find. His least incompetent general is set up as an Alexander. His king is the first gentleman in the world. His pope is a saint. He is never without an array of human idols who are all nothing but sham supermen. That the real Superman will snap his superfingers at all man's present trumpery ideals of right, duty, honor, justice, religion, even decency, and accept moral obligations beyond present human endurance, is a thing that contemporary man does not foresee. In fact, he does not notice it when our casual supermen do it in his very face. He actually does it himself every day without knowing it. He will therefore make no objection to the production of a race of what he calls great men or heroes, because he will imagine them, not as true supermen, but as himself endowed with infinite brains, infinite courage, and infinite money. The most troublesome opposition will arise from the general fear of mankind that any interference with our conjugal customs will be an interference with our pleasures and our romance. This fear, by putting on airs of offended morality, has always intimidated people who have not measured its essential weakness, but it will prevail with those degenerates only in whom the instinct of fertility has faded into a mere itching for pleasure. The modern devices for combining pleasure with sterility, now universally known and accessible, enable these persons to weed themselves out of the race, a process already vigorously at work. And the consequent survival of the intelligently fertile means the survival of the partisans of the Superman. For what is proposed is nothing but the replacement of the old unintelligent, inevitable, almost unconscious fertility by an intelligently controlled, conscious fertility, and the elimination of the mere voluptuary from the evolutionary process. Point 1. Even if this selective agency had not been invented, the purpose of the race would still shatter the opposition of individual instincts. Not only do the bees and the ants satisfy their reproductive and parental instincts vicariously, but marriage itself successfully imposes celibacy on millions of unmarried normal men and women. In short, the individual instinct in this matter, overwhelming as it is thoughtlessly supposed to be, is really a finally negligible one. The political need for the Superman, the need for the Superman, is, in its most imperative aspect, a political one. We have been driven to proletarian democracy by the failure of all the alternative systems, for these depended on the existence of supermen acting as despots or oligarchs. And not only were these supermen not always, or even often forthcoming at the right moment and in an eligible social position, but when they were forthcoming, they could not, except for a short time, and by morally suicidal coercive methods, impose superhumanity on those whom they governed. So, by mere force of human nature, government by consent of the governed has supplanted the old plan of governing the citizen as a public schoolboy is governed. Now we have yet to see the man who, having any practical experience of proletarian democracy, has any belief in its capacity for solving great political problems, or even for doing ordinary parochial work intelligently and economically. Only under despotisms and oligarchies has the radical faith in universal suffrage as a political panacea arisen. It withers the moment it is exposed to practical trial, because democracy cannot rise above the level of the human material of which its voters are made. Switzerland seems happy in comparison with Russia, but if Russia were as small as Switzerland and had her social problems simplified in the same way, by impregnable natural fortifications, and a population educated by the same variety and intimacy of international intercourse, there might be little to choose between them. At all events, Australia and Canada, which are virtually protected democratic republics, and France and the United States, which are avowedly independent democratic republics, are neither healthy, wealthy, nor wise, and they would be worse instead of better if their popular ministers were not experts in the art of dodging popular enthusiasms and duping popular ignorance. The politician who once had to learn how to flatter kings has now to learn how to fascinate, amuse, coax, humbug, frighten, or otherwise strike the fancy of the electorate. And though in advanced modern states, where the artisan is better educated than the king, it takes a much bigger man to be a successful demagogue than to be a successful courtier, yet he who holds popular convictions with prodigious energy is the man for the mob, whilst the frailer skeptic who is cautiously feeling his way towards the next century has no chance unless he happens by accident to have the specific artistic talent of the mountebank as well, in which case it is as a mountebank that he catches votes, and not as a meliorist. Consequently, the demagogue, though he professes, and fails, to readjust matters in the interests of the majority of the electors, yet stereotypes mediocrity, organizes intolerance, disparages exhibitions of uncommon qualities, and glorifies conspicuous exhibitions of common ones. He manages a small job well. He muddles rhetorically through a large one. When a great political movement takes place, it is not consciously led nor organized. The unconscious self in mankind breaks its way through the problem as an elephant breaks through a jungle. And the politicians make speeches about whatever happens in the process, which, with the best intentions, they do all in their power to prevent. Finally, when social aggregation arrives at a point demanding international organization before the demagogues and electorates have learnt how to manage even a country parish properly, much less internationalize Constantinople, the whole political business goes to smash. And presently we have ruins of empires, New Zealanders sitting on a broken arch of London Bridge, and so forth. To that recurrent catastrophe, we shall certainly come again, unless we can have a democracy of supermen. And the production of such a democracy is the only change that is now hopeful enough to nerve us to the effort that revolution demands. V.I. Prudery explained why the bees should pamper their mothers, whilst we pamper only our operatic prima donnas, is a question worth reflecting on. Our notion of treating a mother is, not to increase her supply of food, but to cut it off by forbidding her to work in a factory for a month after her confinement. Everything that can make birth a misfortune to the parents as well as a danger to the mother is conscientiously done. When a great French writer, Émile Zola, alarmed at the sterilization of his nation, wrote an eloquent and powerful book to restore the prestige of parentage, it was at once assumed in England that a work of this character, with such a title as Fecundity, was too abominable to be translated, and that any attempt to deal with the relations of the sexes from any other than the voluptuary or romantic point of view must be sternly put down. Now, if this assumption were really founded on public opinion, it would indicate an attitude of disgust and resentment towards the life force that could only arise in a diseased and moribund community in which Ibsen's Hedda Gabler would be the typical woman. But it has no vital foundation at all. The prudery of the newspapers is, like the prudery of the dinner table, a mere difficulty of education and language. We are not taught to think decently on these subjects, and consequently we have no language for them except indecent language. We therefore have to declare them unfit for public discussion, because the only terms in which we can conduct the discussion are unfit for public use. Physiologists, who have a technical vocabulary at their disposal, find no difficulty, and masters of language who think decently can write popular stories like Zola's Fecundity or Tolstoy's Resurrection without giving the smallest offense to readers who can also think decently. But the ordinary modern journalist, who has never discussed such matters except in ribaldry, cannot write a simple comment on a divorce case without a conscious shamefulness or a furtive facetiousness that makes it impossible to read the comment aloud in company. All this ribaldry and prudery, the two are the same, does not mean that people do not feel decently on the subject. On the contrary, it is just the depth and seriousness of our feeling that makes its desecration by vile language and coarse humor intolerable, so that at last we cannot bear to have it spoken of at all, because only 1 in 1,000 can speak of it without wounding our self-respect, especially the self-respect of women. Add to the horrors of popular language the horrors of popular poverty. In crowded populations, poverty destroys the possibility of cleanliness, and in the absence of cleanliness, many of the natural conditions of life become offensive and noxious, with the result that at last the association of uncleanliness with these natural conditions becomes so overpowering that among civilized people, that is, people massed in the labyrinths of slums we call cities, half their bodily life becomes a guilty secret, unmentionable except to the doctor in emergencies, and Hedda Gabler shoots herself because maternity is so unladylike. In short, popular prudery is only a mere incident of popular squalor. The subjects which it taboos remain the most interesting and earnest of subjects in spite of it. Romans 7 Progress, an illusion unfortunately, the earnest people get drawn off the track of evolution by the illusion of progress. Any socialist can convince us easily that the difference between man as he is and man as he might become, without further evolution, under millennial conditions of nutrition, environment, and training, is enormous. He can show that inequality and iniquitous distribution of wealth and allotment of labor have arisen through an unscientific economic system, and that man, faulty as he is, no more intended to establish any such ordered disorder than a moth intends to be burnt when it flies into a candle flame. He can show that the difference between the grace and strength of the acrobat and the bent back of the rheumatic field laborer is a difference produced by conditions, not by nature. He can show that many of the most detestable human vices are not radical, but are mere reactions of our institutions on our very virtues. The anarchist, the Fabian, the Salvationist, the vegetarian, the doctor, the lawyer, the parson, the professor of ethics, the gymnast, the soldier, the sportsman, the inventor, the political program maker, all have some prescription for bettering us, and almost all their remedies are physically possible and aimed at admitted evils. To them, the limit of progress is, at worst, the completion of all the suggested reforms and the leveling up of all men to the point attained already by the most highly nourished and cultivated in mind and body. Here, then, as it seems to them, is an enormous field for the energy of the reformer. Here are many noble goals attainable by many of those paths up the hill difficulty along which great spirits love to aspire. Unhappily, the hill will never be climbed by man as we know him. It need not be denied that if we all struggled bravely to the end of the reformer's paths, we should improve the world prodigiously. But there is no more hope in that if than in the equally plausible assurance that if the sky falls we shall all catch larks. We are not going to tread those paths. We have not sufficient energy. We do not desire the end enough. Indeed, in more cases, we do not effectively desire it at all. Ask any man would he like to be a better man, and he will say yes, most piously. Ask him would he like to have 1,000,000 of money, and he will say yes, most sincerely. But the pious citizen who would like to be a better man goes on behaving just as he did before. And the tramp who would like the 1,000,000 does not take the trouble to earn 10 shillings. Multitudes of men and women, all eager to accept a legacy of 1 million, live and die without having ever possessed 5 pounds at one time. Although beggars have died in rags on mattresses stuffed with gold, which they accumulated, because they desired it enough to nerve them to get it and keep it. The economists who discovered that demand created supply soon had to limit the proposition to effective demand, which turned out, in the final analysis, to mean nothing more than supply itself. And this holds good in politics, morals, and all other departments as well. The actual supply is the measure of the effective demand, and the mere aspirations and professions produce nothing. No community has ever yet passed beyond the initial phases in which its pugnacity and fanaticism enabled it to found a nation, and its cupidity to establish and develop a commercial civilization. Even these stages have never been attained by public spirit, but always by intolerant willfulness and brute force. Take the Reform Bill of 1832 as an example of a conflict between two sections of educated Englishmen concerning a political measure, which was as obviously necessary and inevitable as any political measure has ever been or is ever likely to be. It was not passed until the gentlemen of Birmingham had made arrangements to cut the throats of the gentlemen of St. James's Parish in due military form. It would not have been passed to this day if there had been no force behind it, except the logic and public conscience of the utilitarians. A despotic ruler with as much sense as Queen Elizabeth would have done better than the mob of grown-up Eton boys who governed us then by privilege, and who, since the introduction of practically manhood suffrage in 1884, now govern us at the request of proletarian democracy. At the present time, we have, instead of the utilitarians, the Fabian Society, with its peaceful, constitutional, moral, economical policy of socialism, which needs nothing for its bloodless and benevolent realization except that the English people shall understand it and approve of it. But why are the Fabians well spoken of in circles where 30 years ago the word socialist was understood as equivalent to cutthroat and incendiary? Not because the English have the smallest intention of studying or adopting the Fabian policy, but because they believe that the Fabians, by eliminating the element of intimidation from the socialist agitation, have drawn the teeth of insurgent poverty and saved the existing order from the only method of attack it really fears. Of course, if the nation adopted the Fabian policy, it would be carried out by brute force exactly as our present property system is. It would become the law, and those who resisted it would be fined, sold up, knocked on the head by policemen, thrown into prison, and in the last resort, executed, just as they are when they break the present law. But as our proprietary class has no fear of that conversion taking place, whereas it does fear sporadic cutthroats and gunpowder plots, and strives with all its might to hide the fact that there is no moral difference whatever between the methods by which it enforces its proprietary rights and the method by which the dynamitad asserts his conception of natural human rights. The Fabian Society is patted on the back, just as the Christian Social Union is, whilst the socialist who says bluntly that a social revolution can be made only, as all other revolutions have been made, by the people who want it killing, coercing, and intimidating the people who don't want it, is denounced as a misleader of the people, and imprisoned with hard labor to show him how much sincerity there is in the objection of his captors to physical force. Are we then to repudiate Fabian methods and return to those of the barricada, or adopt those of the dynamitad and the assassin? On the contrary, we are to recognize that both are fundamentally futile. It seems easy for the dynamitad to say, "Have you not just admitted that nothing is ever conceded except to physical force?" Did not Gladstone admit that the Irish Church was disestablished, not by the spirit of liberalism, but by the explosion which wrecked Clerkenwell Prison? Well, we need not foolishly and timidly deny it. Let it be fully granted. Let us grant further that all this lies in the nature of things, that the most ardent socialist, if he owns property, can by no means do otherwise than conservative proprietors until property is forcibly abolished by the whole nation. Nay, that ballots and parliamentary divisions, in spite of their vain ceremony of discussion, differ from battles only as the bloodless surrender of an outnumbered force in the field differs from Waterloo or Trafalgar. I make a present of all these admissions to the Fenian who collects money from thoughtless Irishmen in America to blow up Dublin Castle, to the detective who persuades foolish young workmen to order bombs from the nearest ironmonger and then delivers them up to penal servitude, To our military and naval commanders who believe, not in preaching, but in an ultimatum backed by plenty of lyddite, and generally, to all whom it may concern. But of what use is it to substitute the way of the reckless and bloody-minded for the way of the cautious and humane? Is England any the better for the wreck of Clerkenwell Prison, or Ireland for the disestablishment of the Irish Church? Is there the smallest reason to suppose that the nation which sheepishly let Charles and Laud and Strafford coerce it gained anything because it afterwards, still more sheepishly, let a few strong-minded Puritans, inflamed by the masterpieces of Jewish revolutionary literature, cut off the heads of the three? Suppose the gunpowder plot had succeeded and set a Fox dynasty permanently on the throne, would it have made any difference to the present state of the nation? The guillotine was used in France up to the limit of human endurance, both on Girondins and Jacobins. Fauquier Tinville followed Marie Antoinette to the scaffold, and Marie Antoinette might have asked the crowd, just as pointedly as Fauquier did, whether their bread would be any cheaper when her head was off. And what came of it all? The imperial France of the Rougon-Macquart family, and the Republican France of the Panama scandal and the Dreyfus case. Was the difference worth the guillotining of all those unlucky ladies and gentlemen, useless and mischievous as many of them were? Would any sane man guillotine a mouse to bring about such a result? Turn to Republican America. America has no Star Chamber and no feudal barons, but it has trusts, and it has millionaires whose factories, fenced in by live electric wires and defended by Pinkerton retainers with magazine rifles, would have made a radical of Reginald Front de Boeuf. Would Washington or Franklin have lifted a finger in the cause of American independence if they had foreseen its reality? No. What Caesar, Cromwell, Napoleon could not do with all the physical force and moral prestige of the state in their hands cannot be done by enthusiastic criminals and lunatics. Even the Jews, who, from Moses to Marx and Lassalle, have inspired all the revolutions, have had to confess that, after all, the dog will return to his vomit, and the sow that was washed to her wallowing in the mire. And we may as well make up our minds that man will return to his idols and his cupidities, in spite of movements and all revolutions, until his nature is changed. Until then, his early successes in building commercial civilizations, and such civilizations, good heavens, are but preliminaries to the inevitable later stage, now threatening us, in which the passions which built the civilization become fatal instead of productive, just as the same qualities which make the lion king in the forest ensure his destruction when he enters a city. Nothing can save society then except the clear head and the wide purpose. War and competition, potent instruments of selection and evolution in one epoch, become ruinous instruments of degeneration in the next. In the breeding of animals and plants, varieties which have arisen by selection through many generations relapse precipitously into the wild type in a generation or two, when selection ceases. And in the same way, a civilization in which lusty pugnacity and greed have ceased to act as selective agents and have begun to obstruct and destroy, rushes downwards and backwards with a suddenness that enables an observer to see with consternation the upward steps of many centuries retraced in a single lifetime. This has often occurred even within the period covered by history, and in every instance the turning point has been reached long before the attainment, or even the general advocacy on paper, of the leveling up of the mass to the highest point attainable by the best nourished and cultivated normal individuals. We must therefore frankly give up the notion that man as he exists is capable of net progress. There will always be an illusion of progress, because wherever we are conscious of an evil we remedy it, and therefore always seem to ourselves to be progressing, forgetting that most of the evils we see are the effects, finally become acute, of long unnoticed retrogressions, that our compromising remedies seldom fully recover the lost ground. Above all, that on the lines along which we are degenerating, good has become evil in our eyes, and is being undone in the name of progress precisely as evil is undone and replaced by good on the lines along which we are evolving. This is indeed the illusion of illusions, for it gives us infallible and appalling assurance that if our political ruin is to come, it will be effected by ardent reformers and supported by enthusiastic patriots as a series of necessary steps in our progress. Let the reformer, the progressive, the meliorist then reconsider himself and his eternal ifs and ands, which never become pots and pans. Whilst man remains what he is, There can be no progress beyond the point already attained and fallen headlong from it every attempt at civilization. And since even that point is but a pinnacle to which a few people cling in giddy terror above an abyss of squalor, mere progress should no longer charm us. Roman 8. The conceit of civilization, after all, the progress illusion is not so very subtle. We begin by reading the satires of our fathers' contemporaries, and we conclude, usually quite ignorantly, that the abuses exposed by them are things of the past. We see also that reforms of crying evils are frequently produced by the sectional shifting of political power from oppressors to oppressed. The poor man is given a vote by the liberals in the hope that he will cast it for his emancipators. The hope is not fulfilled, but the lifelong imprisonment of penniless men for debt ceases. Factory acts are passed to mitigate sweating. Schooling is made free and compulsory. Sanitary bylaws are multiplied. Public steps are taken to house the masses decently. The barefooted get boots, rags become rare, and bathrooms and pianos, smart tweeds and starched collars, reach numbers of people who once, as the unsoaped, played the Jew's harp or the accordion in moleskins and belchers. Some of these changes are gains, some of them are losses. Some of them are not changes at all. All of them are merely the changes that money makes. Still, they produce an illusion of bustling progress, and the reading class infers from them that the abuses of the early Victorian period no longer exist except as amusing pages in the novels of Dickens. But the moment we look for a reform due to character and not to money, to statesmanship and not to interest or mutiny, we are disillusioned. For example, we remembered the maladministration and incompetence revealed by the Crimean War as part of a bygone state of things, until the South African War showed that the nation and the War Office, like those poor Bourbons who have been so impudently blamed for a universal characteristic, had learnt nothing and forgotten nothing. We had hardly recovered from the fruitless irritation of this discovery when it transpired that the officers' mess of our most select regiment included a flogging club presided over by the senior subaltern. The disclosure provoked some disgust at the details of this schoolboyish debauchery, but no surprise at the apparent absence of any conception of manly honor and virtue, of personal courage and self-respect, in the front rank of our chivalry. In civil affairs, we had assumed that the sycophancy and idolatry, which encouraged Charles I to undervalue the Puritan revolt of the 17th century, had been long outgrown. But it has needed nothing but favorable circumstances to revive, with added abjectness to compensate for its lost piety. We have relapsed into disputes about transubstantiation at the very moment when the discovery of the wide prevalence of theophagy as a tribal custom has deprived us of the last excuse for believing that our official religious rites differ in essentials from those of barbarians. The Christian doctrine of the uselessness of punishment and the wickedness of revenge has not, in spite of its simple common sense, found a single convert among the nations. Christianity means nothing to the masses but a sensational public execution, which is made an excuse for other executions. In its name, we take 10 years of a thief's life minute by minute in the slow misery and degradation of modern, reformed imprisonment, with as little remorse as Laud and his Star Chamber clipped the ears of Bostwick and Burton. We dug up and mutilated the remains of the Mahdi the other day exactly as we dug up and mutilated the remains of Cromwell 2 centuries ago. We have demanded the decapitation of the Chinese Boxer princes as any Tatar would have done, and our military and naval expeditions to kill, burn, and destroy tribes and villages for knocking an Englishman on the head are so common, a part of our imperial routine, that the last dozen of them has not called forth as much pity as can be counted on by any lady criminal. The judicial use of torture to extort confession is supposed to be a relic of darker ages. But whilst these pages are being written, an English judge has sentenced a forger to 20 years penal servitude with an open declaration that the sentence will be carried out in full unless he confesses where he has hidden the notes he forged. And no comment whatever is made, either on this or on a telegram from the seat of war in Somaliland, mentioning that certain information has been given by a prisoner of war under punishment. Even if these reports are false, the fact that they are accepted without protest, as indicating a natural and proper course of public conduct, shows that we are still as ready to resort to torture as Bacon was. As to vindictive cruelty, an incident in the South African War, when the relatives and friends of a prisoner were forced to witness his execution, betrayed a baseness of temper and character, which hardly leaves us the right to plume ourselves on our superiority to Edward Roman III at the surrender of Calais. And the democratic American officer indulges in torture in the Philippines, just as the aristocratic English officer did in South Africa. The incidents of the white invasion of Africa in search of ivory, gold, diamonds, and spot have proved that the modern European is the same beast of prey that formerly marched to the conquest of new worlds under Alexander, Antony, and Pizarro. Parliaments and vestries are just what they were when Cromwell suppressed them and Dickens derided them. The democratic politician remains exactly as Plato described him. The physician is still the credulous impostor and petulant scientific coxcomb whom Molière ridiculed. The schoolmaster remains at best a pedantic child farmer and at worst a flagellomaniac. Arbitrations are more dreaded by honest men than lawsuits. The philanthropist is still a parasite on misery, as the doctor is on disease. The miracles of priestcraft are none the less fraudulent and mischievous because they are now called scientific experiments and conducted by professors. Witchcraft, in the modern form of patent medicines and prophylactic inoculations, is rampant. The landowner who is no longer powerful enough to set the mantrap of Rempsonitis improves on it by barbed wire. The modern gentleman who is too lazy to daub his face with vermilion as a symbol of bravery employs a laundress to daub his shirt with starch as a symbol of cleanliness. We shake our heads at the dirt of the Middle Ages in cities, made grimy with soot and foul, and disgusting with shameless tobacco smoking. Holy water, in its latest form of disinfectant fluid, is more widely used and believed in than ever. Public health authorities deliberately go through incantations with burning sulfur, which they know to be useless, because the people believe in it as devoutly as the Italian peasant believes in the liquefaction of the blood of St. Januarius. And straightforward public lying has reached gigantic developments, there being nothing to choose in this respect between the pickpocket at the police station and the minister on the Treasury bench, the editor in the newspaper office, the city magnate advertising bicycle tires that do not sideslip, the clergyman subscribing the 39 articles, and the vivisector who pledges his knightly honor that no animal operated on in the physiological laboratory suffers the slightest pain. Hypocrisy is at its worst, for we not only persecute bigotedly, but sincerely in the name of the cure-mongering witchcraft we do believe in, but callously and hypocritically in the name of the evangelical creed that our rulers privately smile at, as the Italian patricians of the 5th century smiled at Jupiter and Venus. Spot is, as it has always been, murderous excitement. The impulse to slaughter is universal, and museums are set up throughout the country to encourage little children and elderly gentlemen to make collections of corpses preserved in alcohol, and to steal birds' eggs and keep them as the Red Indian used to keep scalps. Coercion with the lash is as natural to an Englishman as it was to Solomon spoiling Rehoboam. Indeed, the comparison is unfair to the Jews in view of the facts that the Mosaic law forbade more than 40 lashes in the name of humanity, and that floggings of 1,000 lashes were inflicted on English soldiers in the 18th and 19th centuries, and would be inflicted still, but for the change in the balance of political power between the military caste and the commercial classes and the proletariat. In spite of that change, flogging is still an institution in the public school, in the military prison, on the training ship, and in that school of littleness called the home. The lascivious clamor of the flagellomaniac for more of it, constant as the clamor for more insolence, more war, and lower rates, is tolerated and even gratified because, having no moral ends in view, we have sense enough to see that nothing but brute coercion can impose our selfish will on others. Cowardice is universal. Patriotism, public opinion, parental duty, discipline, religion, morality are only fine names for intimidation, and cruelty, gluttony, and credulity keep cowardice in countenance. We cut the throat of a calf and hang it up by the heels to bleed to death, so that our veal cutlet may be white. We nail geese to a bod and cram them with food, because we like the taste of liver disease. We tear birds to pieces to decorate our women's hats. We mutilate domestic animals for no reason at all, except to follow an instinctively cruel fashion. And we connive at the most abominable tortures in the hope of discovering some magical cure for our own diseases by them. Now please observe that these are not exceptional developments of our admitted vices, deplored and prayed against by all good men. Not a word has been said here of the excesses of our Neros, of whom we have the full usual percentage. With the exception of the few military examples, which are mentioned mainly to show that the education and standing of a gentleman, reinforced by the strongest conventions of honor, esprit de corps, publicity and responsibility, afford no better guarantees of conduct than the passions of a mob. The illustrations given above are commonplaces taken from the daily practices of our best citizens, vehemently defended in our newspapers and in our pulpits. The very humanitarians who abhor them are stirred to murder by them. The dagger of Brutus and Ravaillac is still active in the hands of Caserio and Lucani, and the pistol has come to its aid in the hands of Gaitau and Cizolgos. Our remedies are still limited to endurance or assassination, and the assassin is still judicially assassinated on the principle that two blacks make a white. The only novelty is in our methods. Through the discovery of dynamite, the overloaded musket of Hamilton of Bothwell Haugh has been superseded by the bomb, but Ravacol's heart burns just as Hamilton's did. The world will not bear thinking of to those who know what it is, even with the largest discount for the restraints of poverty on the poor and cowardice on the rich. All that can be said for us is that people must and do live and let live up to a certain point. Even the hoss, with his docked tail and bitted jaw, finds his slavery mitigated by the fact that a total disregard of his need for food and rest would put his master to the expense of buying a new hoss every second day. For you cannot work a hoss to death and then pick up another one for nothing, as you can a laborer. But this natural check on inconsiderate selfishness is itself checked, partly by our short-sightedness, and partly by deliberate calculation, so that beside the man who, to his own loss, will shorten his hoss's life in mere stinginess, we have the tramway company which discovers actuarially that though a hoss may live from 24 to 40 years, yet it pays better to work him to death in 4 and then replace him by a fresh victim. And human slavery, which has reached its worst recorded point within our own time in the form of free wage labor, has encountered the same personal and commercial limits to both its aggravation and its mitigation. Now that the freedom of wage labor has produced a scarcity of it, as in South Africa, the leading English newspaper and the leading English weekly review have openly and without apology demanded a return to compulsory labor. That is, to the methods by which, as we believe, the Egyptians built the pyramids. We know now that the crusade against chattel slavery in the 19th century succeeded solely because chattel slavery was neither the most effective nor the least humane method of labor exploitation. And the world is now feeling its way towards a still more effective system which shall abolish the freedom of the worker without again making his exploiter responsible for him. Still, there is always some mitigation. There is the fear of revolt, and there are the effects of kindliness and affection. Let it be repeated, therefore, that no indictment is here laid against the world on the score of what its criminals and monsters do. The fires of Smithfield and of the Inquisition were lighted by earnestly pious people, who were kind and good as kindness and goodness go. And when a Negro is dipped in kerosene and set on fire in America at the present time, he is not a good man lynched by ruffians. He is a criminal lynched by crowds of respectable, charitable, virtuously indignant, high-minded citizens, who, though they act outside the law, are at least more merciful than the American legislators and judges who not so long ago condemned men to solitary confinement for periods, not of 5 months, as our own practice is, but of 5 years and more. The things that our moral monsters do may be left out of account with St. Bartholomew massacres and other momentary outbursts of social disorder. Judge us by the admitted and respected practice of our most reputable circles, and if you know the facts and are strong enough to look them in the face, you must admit that unless we are replaced by a more highly evolved animal, in short, by the Superman, the world must remain a den of dangerous animals among whom our few accidental supermen, our Shakespeares, Goethes, Shelleys, and their like, must live as precariously as lion tamers do, taking the humor of their situation and the dignity of their superiority as a set-off to the horror of the one and the loneliness of the other. Roman 9, the verdict of history, it may be said, that though the wild beast breaks out in man and casts him back momentarily into barbarism under the excitement of war and crime, yet his normal life is higher than the normal life of his forefathers. This view is very acceptable to Englishmen, who always lean sincerely to virtue's side as long as it costs them nothing either in money or in thought. They feel deeply the injustice of foreigners, who allow them no credit for this conditional high-mindedness. But there is no reason to suppose that our ancestors were less capable of it than we are. To all such claims for the existence of a progressive moral evolution, operating visibly from grandfather to grandson, there is the conclusive reply that 1,000 years of such evolution would have produced enormous social changes, of which the historical evidence would be overwhelming. But not Macaulay himself, the most confident of Whig meliorists, can produce any such evidence that will bear cross-examination. Compare our conduct and our codes with those mentioned contemporarily in such ancient scriptures and classics as have come down to us, and you will find no jot of ground for the belief that any moral progress, whatever has been made in historic time, in spite of all the romantic attempts of historians to reconstruct the past on that assumption. Within that time, it has happened to nations as to private families and individuals that they have flourished and decayed, repented and hardened their hearts, submitted and protested, acted and reacted, oscillated between natural and artificial sanitation. The oldest house in the world, unearthed the other day in Crete, has quite modern sanitary arrangements, and rung 1,000 changes on the different scales of income and pressure of population, firmly believing all the time that mankind was advancing by leaps and bounds because men were constantly busy. And the mere chapter of accidents has left a small accumulation of chance discoveries, such as the wheel, the arch, the safety pin, gunpowder, the magnet, the voltaic pile, and so forth. Things which, unlike the Gospels and philosophic treatises of the sages, can be usefully understood and applied by common men, so that steam locomotion is possible without a nation of Stephensons, although national Christianity is impossible without a nation of Christs. But does any man seriously believe that the chauffeur who drives a motor car from Paris to Berlin is a more highly evolved man than the charioteer of Achilles, or that a modern prime minister is a more enlightened ruler than Caesar because he rides a tricycle, writes his dispatches by the electric light, and instructs his stockbroker through the telephone? Enough, then, of this goosecackle about progress. Man, as he is, never will knock and add a cubit to his stature by any of its quackeries, political, scientific, educational, religious, or artistic. What is likely to happen when this conviction gets into the minds of the men whose present faith in these illusions is the cement of our social system, can be imagined only by those who know how suddenly a civilization which has long ceased to think, or in the old phrase, to watch and pray, can fall to pieces when the vulgar belief in its hypocrisies and impostures can no longer hold out against its failures and scandals. When religious and ethical formulae become so obsolete that no man of strong mind can believe them, they have also reached the point at which no man of high character will profess them. And from that moment until they are formally disestablished, they stand at the door of every profession and every public office to keep out every able man who is not a sophist or a liar. A nation which revises its parish councils once in 3 years, but will not revise its articles of religion once in 300, even when those articles avowedly began as a political compromise dictated by Mr. Facing Both Ways, is a nation that needs remaking. Our only hope, then, is in evolution. We must replace the man by the Superman. It is frightful for the citizen, as the years pass him, to see his own contemporaries so exactly reproduced by the younger generation that his companions of 30 years ago have their counterparts in every city crowd, where he had to check himself repeatedly in the act of saluting as an old friend some young man to whom he is only an elderly stranger. All hope of advance dies in his bosom as he watches them. He knows that they will do just what their fathers did, and that the few voices which will still, as always before, exhort them to do something else and be something better, might as well spare their breath to cool their porridge, if they can get any. Men like Ruskin and Carlyle will preach to Smith and Brown for the sake of preaching, just as St. Francis preached to the birds and St. Anthony to the fishes. But Smith and Brown, like the fishes and birds, remain as they are, and poets who plan utopias and prove that nothing is necessary for their realization, but that man should will them, perceive at last, like Richard Wagner, that the fact to be faced is that man does not effectively will them, and he never will until he becomes Superman. And so we arrive at the end of the socialist's dream of the socialization of the means of production and exchange, of the positivist's dream of moralizing the capitalist, and of the ethical professors, legislators, Educators dream of putting commandments and codes and lessons and examination, marks on a man as harness is put on a horse, ermine on a judge, pipe clay on a soldier, or a wig on an actor, and pretending that his nature has been changed. The only fundamental and possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man, in other terms, of human evolution. We must eliminate the Yahoo, or his vote will wreck the Commonwealth. X the method as to the method, what can be said as yet except that where there is a will, there is a way? If there be no will, we are lost. That is a possibility for our crazy little empire, if not for the universe. And as such possibilities are not to be entertained without despair, we must, whilst we survive, proceed on the assumption that we have still energy enough to not only will to live, but to will to live better. That may mean that we must establish a State Department of Evolution, with a seat in the cabinet for its chief, and a revenue to defray the cost of direct state experiments, and provide inducements to private persons to achieve successful results. It may mean a private society or a chartered company for the improvement of human livestock. But for the present, it is far more likely to mean a blatant repudiation of such proposals as indecent and immoral, with, nevertheless, a general secret pushing of the human will in the repudiated direction, so that all sorts of institutions and public authorities will under some pretext or other feel their way furtively towards the Superman. Mr. Graham Wallace has already ventured to suggest, as chairman of the School Management Committee of the London School Board, that the accepted policy of the sterilization of the schoolmistress, however administratively convenient, is open to criticism from the national stock breeding point of view, and this is as good an example as any of the way in which the drift towards the Superman may operate in spite of all our hypocrisies. One thing at least is clear to begin with. If a woman can, by careful selection of a father and nourishment of herself, produce a citizen with efficient senses, sound organs, and a good digestion, she should clearly be secured a sufficient reward for that natural service to make her willing to undertake and repeat it. Whether she be financed in the undertaking by herself, or by the father, or by a speculative capitalist, or by a new department of, say, the Royal Dublin Society, or, as at present, by the War Office maintaining her on the strength and authorizing a particular soldier to marry her, or by a local authority under a bylaw directing that women may under certain circumstances have a year's leave of absence on full salary, or by the central government, does not matter provided the result be satisfactory. It is a melancholy fact that as the vast majority of women and their husbands have, under existing circumstances, not enough nourishment, no capital, no credit, and no knowledge of science or business, they would, if the state would pay for birth as it now pays for death, be exploited by joint stock companies for dividends, just as they are in ordinary industries. Even a joint stock human stud farm, piously disguised as a reformed foundling hospital, or something of that sort, might well, under proper inspection and regulation, produce better results than our present reliance on promiscuous marriage. It may be objected that when an ordinary contractor produces stores for sale to the government, and the government rejects them as not up to the required standard, the condemned goods are either sold for what they will fetch or else scrapped, that is, treated as waste material. Whereas if the goods consisted of human beings, all that could be done would be to let them loose or send them to the nearest workhouse. But there is nothing new in private enterprise throwing its human refuse on the cheap labor market and the workhouse, and the refuse of the new industry would presumably be better bred than the staple product of ordinary poverty. In our present happy-go-lucky industrial disorder, all the human products, successful or not, would have to be thrown on the labor market, but the unsuccessful ones would not entitle the company to a bounty, and so would be a dead loss to it. The practical commercial difficulty would be the uncertainty and the cost in time and money of the first experiments. Purely commercial capital would not touch such heroic operations during the experimental stage, and in any case, the strength of mind needed for so momentous a new departure could not be fairly expected from the stock exchange. It will have to be handled by statesmen with character enough to tell our democracy and plutocracy that statecraft does not consist in flattering their follies or applying their suburban standards of propriety to the affairs of far continents. The matter must be taken up either by the state or by some organization strong enough to impose respect upon the state. The novelty of any such experiment, however, is only in the scale of it. In one conspicuous case, that of royalty, the state does already select the parents on purely political grounds. And in the peerage, though the heir to a dukedom is legally free to marry a dairymaid, yet the social pressure on him to confine his choice to politically and socially eligible mates is so overwhelming that he is really no more free to marry the dairymaid than George Roman Faw was to marry Mrs. Fitzherbert. And such a marriage could only occur as a result of extraordinary strength of character on the part of the dairymaid, acting upon extraordinary weakness on the part of the duke. Let those who think the whole conception of intelligent breeding absurd and scandalous ask themselves why George Roman Faw was not allowed to choose his own wife, whilst any tinker could marry whom he pleased. Simply because it did not matter a rap politically whom the tinker married, whereas it mattered very much whom the king married. The way in which all considerations of the king's personal rights, of the claims of the heart, of the sanctity of the marriage oath, and of romantic morality crumpled up before this political need shows how negligible all these apparently irresistible prejudices are when they come into conflict with the demand for quality in our rulers. We learn the same lesson from the case of the soldier, whose marriage, when it is permitted at all, is despotically controlled with a view solely to military efficiency. Well, nowadays it is not the king that rules, but the tinker. Dynastic wars are no longer feared, dynastic alliances no longer valued. Marriages in royal families are becoming rapidly less political and more popular, domestic, and romantic. If all the kings in Europe were made as free tomorrow as King Cophetua, nobody but their aunts and chamberlains would feel a moment's anxiety as to the consequences. On the other hand, a sense of the social importance of the tinker's marriage has been steadily growing. We have made a public matter of his wife's health in the month after her confinement. We have taken the minds of his children out of his hands and put them into those of our state schoolmaster. We shall presently make their bodily nourishment independent of him, but they are still riffraff, and to hand the country over to riffraff is national suicide, since riffraff can neither govern nor will let anyone else govern except the highest bidder of bread and circuses. There is no public enthusiast alive of 20 years' practical democratic experience who believes in the political adequacy of the electorate or of the bodies it elects. The overthrow of the aristocrat has created the necessity for the superman. Englishmen hate liberty and equality too much to understand them, but every Englishman loves and desires a pedigree, and in that he is right. King Demos must be bred like all other kings, and with must there is no arguing. It is idle for an individual writer to carry so great a matter further in a pamphlet. A conference on the subject is the next step needed. It will be attended by men and women who, no longer believing that they can live forever, are seeking for some immortal work into which they can build the best of themselves before their refuse is thrown into that arch-dust destructor, the cremation furnace. Maxims for revolutionists: the golden rule, do not do unto others as you would that they should do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same. Never resist temptation. Prove all things. Hold fast that which is good. Do not love your neighbor as yourself. If you are on good terms with yourself, it is an impertinence; if on bad, an injury. The golden rule is that there are no golden rules. Idolatry, the art of government, is the organization of idolatry. The bureaucracy consists of functionaries, the aristocracy of idols, the democracy of idolaters. The populace cannot understand the bureaucracy. It can only worship the national idols. The savage bows down to idols of wood and stone, the civilized man to idols of flesh and blood. A limited monarchy is a device for combining the inertia of a wooden idol with the credibility of a flesh and blood one. When the wooden idol does not answer the peasant's prayer, he beats it. When the flesh and blood idol does not satisfy the civilized man, he cuts its head off. He who slays a king and he who dies for him are alike idolaters. Royalty kings are not born, they are made by artificial hallucination. When the process is interrupted by adversity at a critical age, as in the case of Charles Roman II, the subject becomes sane and never completely recovers his kingliness. The cot is the servants' hall of the sovereign. Vulgarity in a king flatters the majority of the nation. The flunkeyism propagated by the throne is the price we pay for its political convenience. Democracy, if the lesser mind could measure the greater as a footrule can measure a pyramid, there would be finality in universal suffrage. As it is, the political problem remains unsolved. Democracy substitutes election by the incompetent many for appointment by the corrupt few. Democratic republics can no more dispense with national idols than monarchies with public functionaries. Government presents only one problem: the discovery of a trustworthy anthropometric method. Imperialism, excessive insularity, makes a Briton an imperialist. Excessive local self-assertion makes a colonist an imperialist. A colonial imperialist is one who raises colonial troops, equips a colonial squadron, claims a federal parliament sending its measures to the throne instead of to the colonial office, and, being finally brought by this means into insoluble conflict with the insular British imperialist, cuts the painter and breaks up the empire. Liberty and equality: he who confuses political liberty with freedom and political equality with similarity has never thought for 5 minutes about either. Nothing can be unconditional. Consequently, nothing can be free. Liberty means responsibility. That is why most men dread it. The Duke inquires contemptuously whether his gamekeeper is the equal of the Astronomer Royal, but he insists that they shall both be hanged equally if they murder him. The notion that the colonel need be a better man than the private is as confused as the notion that the keystone need be stronger than the coping stone. Where equality is undisputed, so also is subordination. Equality is fundamental in every department of social organization. The relation of superior to inferior excludes good manners. Education: when a man teaches something he does not know to somebody else who has no aptitude for it, and gives him a certificate of proficiency, the latter has completed the education of a gentleman. A fool's brain digests philosophy into folly, science into superstition, and art into pedantry. Hence university education. The best brought-up children are those who have seen their parents as they are. Hypocrisy is not the parent's first duty. The vilest debauchist is he who attempts to mold a child's character. At the university, every great treatise is postponed until its author attains impartial judgment and perfect knowledge. If a horse could wait as long for its shoes and would pay for them in advance, our blacksmiths would all be college dons. He who can does. He who cannot teaches. A learned man is an idler who kills time with study. Beware of his false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance. Activity is the only road to knowledge. Every fool believes what his teachers tell him and calls his credulity science or morality as confidently as his father called it divine revelation. No man fully capable of his own language ever masters another. No man can be a pure specialist without being in the strict sense an idiot. Do not give your children moral and religious instruction unless you are quite sure they will not take it too seriously. Better be the mother of Henry Quatter and Nell Gwyn than of Robespierre and Queen Mary Tudor. Marriage is popular because it combines the maximum of temptation with the maximum of opportunity. Marriage is the only legal contract which abrogates as between the parties all the laws that safeguard the particular relation to which it refers. The essential function of marriage is the continuance of the race, as stated in the Book of Common Prayer. The accidental function of marriage is the gratification of the amoristic sentiment of mankind. The artificial sterilization of marriage makes it possible for marriage to fulfill its accidental function whilst neglecting its essential one. The most revolutionary invention of the 19th century was the artificial sterilization of marriage. Any marriage system which condemns a majority of the population to celibacy will be violently wrecked on the pretext that it outrages morality. Polygamy, when tried under modern democratic conditions, as by the Mormons, is wrecked by the revolt of the mass of inferior men who are condemned to celibacy by it. For the maternal instinct leads a woman to prefer a 10th share in a first-rate man to the exclusive possession of a third-rate one. Polyandry has not been tried under these conditions. The minimum of national celibacy, ascertained by dividing the number of males in the community by the number of females, and taking the quotient as the number of wives or husbands permitted to each person, is secured in England, where the quotient is 1, by the institution of monogamy. The modern sentimental term for the national minimum of celibacy is purity. Marriage, or any other form of promiscuous amoristic monogamy, is fatal to large states because it puts its ban on the deliberate breeding of man as a political animal. Crime and punishment, all scoundrelism, is summed up in the phrase, "Que messieurs les assassins commencent." The man who has graduated from the flogging block at Eton to the bench from which he sentences the garroter to be flogged is the same social product as the garroter who has been kicked by his father and cuffed by his mother, until he has grown strong enough to throttle and rob the rich citizen whose money he desires. Imprisonment is as irrevocable as death. Criminals do not die by the hands of the law. They die by the hands of other men. The assassin Czolgosz made President McKinley a hero by assassinating him. The United States of America made Czolgosz a hero by the same process. Assassination on the scaffold is the worst form of assassination because there it is invested with the approval of society. It is the deed that teaches, not the name we give it. Murder and capital punishment are not opposites that cancel one another, but similars that breed their kind. Crime is only the retail department of what, in wholesale, we call penal law. When a man wants to murder a tiger, he calls it spot. When the tiger wants to murder him, he calls it ferocity. The distinction between crime and justice is no greater. Whilst we have prisons, it matters little which of us occupy the cells. The most anxious man in a prison is the governor. It is not necessary to replace a guillotined criminal. It is necessary to replace a guillotined social system. Titles distinguish the mediocre, embarrass the superior, and are disgraced by the inferior. Great men refuse titles because they are jealous of them. Honor, there are no perfectly honorable men, but every true man has one main point of honor and a few minor ones. You cannot believe in honor until you have achieved it. Better keep yourself clean and bright. You are the window through which you must see the world. Your word can never be as good as your bond, because your memory can never be as trustworthy as your honor. Property, said Proudhon, is theft. This is the only perfect truism that has been uttered on the subject. Servants, when domestic servants are treated as human beings, it is not worthwhile to keep them. The relation of master and servant is advantageous only to masters who do not scruple to abuse their authority, and to servants who do not scruple to abuse their trust. The perfect servant, when his master makes humane advances to him, feels that his existence is threatened and hastens to change his place. Masters and servants are both tyrannical, but the masters are the more dependent of the two. A man enjoys what he uses, not what his servants use. Man is the only animal which esteems itself rich in proportion to the number and voracity of its parasites. Ladies and gentlemen are permitted to have friends in the kennel, but not in the kitchen. Domestic servants, by making spoiled children of their masters, are forced to intimidate them in order to be able to live with them. In a slave state, the slaves rule. In Mayfair, the tradesman rules. How to beat children if you strike a child. Take care that you strike it in anger, even at the risk of maiming it for life. A blow in cold blood neither can nor should be forgiven. If you beat children for pleasure, avow your object frankly, and play the game according to the rules, as a fox hunter does, and you will do comparatively little harm. No fox hunter is such a cad as to pretend that he hunts the fox to teach it not to steal chickens, or that he suffers more acutely than the fox at the death. Remember that even in child beating, there is the sportsman's way and the cad's way. Religion, beware of the man whose God is in the skies. What a man believes may be ascertained, not from his creed, but from the assumptions on which he habitually acts. Virtues and vices, no specific virtue or vice in a man, implies the existence of any other specific virtue or vice in him, however closely the imagination may associate them. Virtue consists, not in abstaining from vice, but in not desiring it. Self-denial is not a virtue. It is only the effect of prudence on rascality. Obedience simulates subordination as fear of the police simulates honesty. Disobedience, the rarest and most courageous of the virtues, is seldom distinguished from neglect, the laziest and commonest of the vices. Vice is waste of life. Poverty, obedience, and celibacy are the canonical vices. Economy is the art of making the most of life. The love of economy is the root of all virtue. Fair play, the love of fair play, is a spectator's virtue, not of principles. Greatness is only one of the sensations of littleness. In heaven, an angel is nobody in particular. Greatness is the secular name for divinity. Both mean simply what lies beyond us. If a great man could make us understand him, we should hang him. We admit that when the divinity we worshipped made itself visible and comprehensible, we crucified it. To a mathematician, the 11th means only a single unit. To the bushman who cannot count further than his 10 fingers, it is an incalculable myriad. The difference between the shallowest routinier and the deepest thinker appears, to the latter, trifling, to the former, infinite. In a stupid nation, the man of genius becomes a god. Everybody worships him and nobody does his will. Beauty and happiness, art and riches, happiness and beauty are byproducts. Folly is the direct pursuit of happiness and beauty. Riches and art are spurious receipts for the production of happiness and beauty. He who desires a lifetime of happiness with a beautiful woman desires to enjoy the taste of wine by keeping his mouth always full of it. The most intolerable pain is produced by prolonging the keenest pleasure. The man with toothache thinks everyone happy whose teeth are sound. The poverty-stricken man makes the same mistake about the rich man. The more a man possesses over and above what he uses, the more careworn he becomes. The tyranny that forbids you to make the road with pick and shovel is worse than that which prevents you from lolling along it in a carriage and pair. In an ugly and unhappy world, the richest man can purchase nothing but ugliness and unhappiness. In his efforts to escape from ugliness and unhappiness, the rich man intensifies both. Every new yard of West End creates a new acre of East End. The 19th century was the age of faith in fine art. The results are before us. The perfect gentleman, the fatal reservation of the gentleman, is that he sacrifices everything to his honor except his gentility. A gentleman of our days is one who has money enough to do what every fool would do if he could afford it, that is, consume without producing. The true diagnostic of modern gentility is parasitism. No elaboration of physical or moral accomplishment can atone for the sin of parasitism. A modern gentleman is necessarily the enemy of his country. Even in war, he does not fight to defend it, but to prevent his power of preying on it from passing to a foreigner. Such combatants are patriots in the same sense as two dogs fighting for a bone are lovers of animals. The North American Indian was a type of the sportsman warrior gentleman. The Periclean Athenian was a type of the intellectually and artistically cultivated gentleman. Both were political failures. The modern gentleman, without the hardihood of the one or the culture of the other, has the appetite of both put together. He will not succeed where they failed. He who believes in education, criminal law, and sport needs only property to make him a perfect modern gentleman. Moderation is never applauded for its own sake. A moderately honest man with a moderately faithful wife, moderate drink as both, in a moderately healthy house. That is the true middle-class unit. The unconscious self is the real genius. Your breathing goes wrong the moment your conscious self meddles with it. Except during the 9 months before he draws his first breath, no man manages his affairs as well as a tree does. Reason, the reasonable man, adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. The man who listens to reason is lost. Reason enslaves all whose minds are not strong enough to master her. Decency is indecency's conspiracy of silence. Experience, men are wise in proportion, not to their experience, but to their capacity for experience. If we could learn from mere experience, the stones of London would be wiser than its wisest men. Time's revenges those whom we called brutes had their revenge when Darwin showed us that they are our cousins. The thieves had their revenge when Marx convicted the bourgeoisie of theft. Good intentions, hell is paved with good intentions, not with bad ones. All men mean well. Natural rights, the master of arts, by proving that no man has any natural rights, compels himself to take his own for granted. The right to live is abused whenever it is not constantly challenged. Faute de mieux, in my childhood, I demurred to the description of a certain young lady as the pretty Miss So-and-so. My aunt rebuked me by saying, "Remember always that the least plain sister is the family beauty." No age or condition is without its heroes. The least incapable general in a nation is its Caesar, the least imbecile statesman its Solon, the least confused thinker its Socrates, the least commonplace poet its Shakespeare. Charity is the most mischievous sort of pruriency. Those who minister to poverty and disease are accomplices in the two worst of all the crimes. He who gives money he has not earned is generous with other people's labor. Every genuinely benevolent person loathes almsgiving and mendicity. Fame life levels all men. Death reveals the eminent. Discipline mutiny acts are needed only by officers who command without authority. Divine right needs no whip. Women in the home is the girl's prison and the woman's workhouse. Civilization is a disease produced by the practice of building societies with rotten material. Those who admire modern civilization usually identify it with the steam engine and the electric telegraph. Those who understand the steam engine and the electric telegraph spend their lives in trying to replace them with something better. The imagination cannot conceive a viler criminal than he who should build another London like the present one, nor a greater benefactor than he who should destroy it. Gambling, the most popular method of distributing wealth, is the method of the roulette table. The roulette table pays nobody except him that keeps it. Nevertheless, a passion for gaming is common, though a passion for keeping roulette tables is unknown. Gambling promises the poor what property performs for the rich. That is why the bishops dare not denounce it fundamentally. The social question: do not waste your time on social questions. What is the matter with the poor is poverty. What is the matter with the rich is uselessness. Stray sayings: we are told that when Jehovah created the world, he saw that it was good. What would he say now? The conversion of a savage to Christianity is the conversion of Christianity to savagery. No man dares say so much of what he thinks as to appear to himself an extremist. Mens sana in corpore sano is a foolish saying. The sound body is a product of the sound mind. Decadence can find agents only when it wears the mask of progress. In moments of progress, the noble succeed, because things are going their way. In moments of decadence, the base succeed for the same reason. Hence the world is never without the exhilaration of contemporary success. The reformer for whom the world is not good enough finds himself shoulder to shoulder with him that is not good enough for the world. Every man over 40 is a scoundrel. Youth, which is forgiven everything, forgives itself nothing. Age, which forgives itself everything, is forgiven nothing. When we learn to sing that Britons never will be masters, we shall make an end of slavery. Do not mistake your objection to defeat for an objection to fighting, your objection to being a slave for an objection to slavery, your objection to not being as rich as your neighbor for an objection to poverty. The cowardly, the insubordinate, and the envious share your objections. Take care to get what you like, or you will be forced to like what you get. Where there is no ventilation, fresh air is declared unwholesome. Where there is no religion, hypocrisy becomes good taste. Where there is no knowledge, ignorance calls itself science. If the wicked flourish and the fittest survive, nature must be the god of rascals. If history repeats itself, and the unexpected always happens, how incapable must man be of learning from experience? Compassion is the fellow feeling of the unsound. Those who understand evil pardon it. Those who resent it destroy it. Acquired notions of propriety are stronger than natural instincts. It is easier to recruit for monasteries and convents than to induce an Arab woman to uncover her mouth in public, or a British officer to walk through Bond Street in a golfing cap on an afternoon in May. It is dangerous to be sincere unless you are also stupid. The Chinese tame fowls by clipping their wings, and women by deforming their feet. A petticoat round the ankles serves equally well. Political economy and social economy are amusing intellectual games, but vital economy is the philosopher's stone. When a heretic wishes to avoid martyrdom, he speaks of orthodoxy, true and false, and demonstrates that the true is his heresy. Beware of the man who does not return your blow. He neither forgives you nor allows you to forgive yourself. If you injure your neighbor, better not do it by halves. Sentimentality is the error of supposing that quarter can be given or taken in moral conflicts. 2 starving men cannot be twice as hungry as one, but 2 rascals can be 10 times as vicious as one. Make your cross your crutch, but when you see another man do it, beware of him. Self-sacrifice enables us to sacrifice other people without blushing. If you begin by sacrificing yourself to those you love, you will end by hating those to whom you have sacrificed yourself. Colophon Man and Superman was published in 1904 by George Bernard Shaw. This ebook was produced for Standard eBooks by Asher Smith and is based on a transcription produced in 2006 by Yves Sobol and David Widger for Project Gutenberg, and text from Bartleby and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The cover page is adapted from Native American Advertising Print, Fisk Rubber Co., 1919, a painting completed in 1919 by N.C. Wyeth. The cover and title pages feature the League Spartan and Sots Mill Gaudy typefaces created in 2014 and 2009 by the League of Movable Type. This edition was released on July 14, 2025, 8:18 p.m., and is based on revision 930,052E. The first edition of this ebook was released on March 15, 2021, 1:21 a.m. You can check for updates to this ebook, view its revision history, or download it for different e-reading systems at standardbooksog/ebooks/GeorgeBernardShaw/Man and Superman. The volunteer-driven Standard eBooks project relies on readers like you to submit typos, corrections, and other improvements. Anyone can contribute at Standard Booksog. Epistle dedicatory to Arthur Bingham Walkley. My dear Walkley, you once asked me why I did not write a Don Juan play. The levity with which you assumed this frightful responsibility has probably by this time enabled you to forget it, but the day of reckoning has arrived. Here is your play. I say your play, because qui facit per alium facit per se. Its profits, like its labor, belong to me. Its morals, its manners, its philosophy, its influence on the young, are for you to justify. You were of mature age when you made the suggestion, and you knew your man. It is hardly 15 years since, as twin pioneers of the new journalism of that time, we too, cradled in the same new sheets, made an epoch in the criticism of the theatre and the opera house by making it a pretext for a propaganda of our own views of life. So you cannot plead ignorance of the character of the farce you set in motion. You met me to Apeta le Bourgeois, and if he protests, I hereby refer him to you as the accountable party. I warn you that if you attempt to repudiate your responsibility, I shall suspect you of finding the play too decorous for your taste. The 15 years have made me older and graver. In you, I can detect no such becoming change. Your levities and audacities are like the loves and comforts prayed for by Desdemona. They increase, even as your days do grow. No mere pioneering journal dares meddle with them now. The stately Times itself is alone sufficiently above suspicion to act as your chaperone. And even the Times must sometimes thank its stars that new plays are not produced every day, since after each such event its gravity is compromised, its platitude turned to epigram, its portentousness to wit, its propriety to elegance, and even its decorum into naughtiness by criticisms, which the traditions of the paper do not allow you to sign at the end, but which you take care to sign with the most extravagant flourishes between the lines. I am not sure that this is not a patent of revolution. In 18th century France, the end was at hand when men bought the encyclopedia and found Diderot there. When I buy the Times and find you there, my prophetic ear catches a rattle of 20th century tumbrils. However, that is not my present anxiety. The question is, will you not be disappointed with a Don Juan play, in which not one of that hero's tree adventures is brought upon the stage? To propitiate you, let me explain myself. You will retort that I never do anything else. It is your favorite jibe at me that what I call drama is nothing but explanation. But you must not expect me to adopt your inexplicable, fantastic, petulant, fastidious ways. You must take me as I am, a reasonable, patient, consistent, apologetic, laborious person, with the temperament of a schoolmaster and the pursuits of a vestryman. No doubt that literary knack of mine which happens to amuse the British public distracts attention from my character, but the character is there none the less, solid as bricks. I have a conscience, and conscience is always anxiously explanatory. You, on the contrary, feel that a man who discusses his conscience is much like a woman who discusses her modesty. The only moral farce you condescend to parade is the farce of your wit. The only demand you make in public is the demand of your artistic temperament for symmetry, elegance, style, grace, refinement, and the cleanliness which comes next to godliness if not before it. But my conscience is the genuine pulpit article. It annoys me to see people comfortable when they ought to be uncomfortable, and I insist on making them think in order to bring them to conviction of sin. If you don't like my preaching, you must lump it. I really cannot help it. In the preface to my plays for Puritans, I explain the predicament of our contemporary English drama, forced to deal almost exclusively with cases of sexual attraction, and yet forbidden to exhibit the incidents of that attraction, or even to discuss its nature. Your suggestion that I should write a Don Juan play was virtually a challenge to me to treat this subject myself dramatically. The challenge was difficult enough to be worth accepting, because, when you come to think of it, though we have plenty of dramas with heroes and heroines who are in love and must accordingly marry or perish at the end of the play, or about people whose relations with one another have been complicated by the marriage laws, not to mention the looser sort of plays which trade on the tradition that illicit love affairs are at once vicious and delightful. We have no modern English plays in which the natural attraction of the sexes for one another is made the mainspring of the action. That is why we insist on beauty in our performers, differing herein from the countries our friend William Acha holds up as examples of seriousness to our childish theatres. They're the Juliets and Isoldes, the Romeos and Tristans, might be our mothers and fathers. Not so the English actress. The heroine she impersonates is not allowed to discuss the elemental relations of men and women. All her romantic twaddle about novelette-made love, all her purely legal dilemmas as to whether she was married or betrayed, quite miss our hearts and worry our minds. To console ourselves, we must just look at her. We do so, and her beauty feeds our starving emotions. Sometimes we grumble ungallantly at the lady, because she does not act as well as she looks. But in a drama which, with all its preoccupation with sex, is really void of sexual interest, good looks are more desired than histrionic skill. Let me press this point on you, since you are too clever to raise the fool's cry of paradox whenever I take hold of a stick by the right instead of the wrong end. Why are our occasional attempts to deal with the sex problem on the stage so repulsive and dreary that even those who are most determined that sex questions shall be held open and their discussion kept free cannot pretend to relish these joyless attempts at social sanitation? Is it not because at bottom they are utterly sexless? What is the usual formula for such plays? A woman has, on some past occasion, been brought into conflict with the law which regulates the relations of the sexes. A man, by falling in love with her, or marrying her, is brought into conflict with the social convention which discountenances the woman. Now, the conflicts of individuals with law and convention can be dramatized like all other human conflicts, but they are purely judicial, and the fact that we are much more curious about the suppressed relations between the man and the woman than about the relations between both and our courts of law and private juries of matrons produces that sensation of evasion, of dissatisfaction, of fundamental irrelevance, of shallowness, of useless disagreeableness, of total failure to edify and partial failure to interest, which is as familiar to you in the theatres as it was to me when I, too, frequented those uncomfortable buildings and found our popular playwrights in the mind to, as they thought, emulate Ibsen. I take it that when you asked me for a Don Juan play, you did not want that sort of thing. Nobody does. The successes such plays sometimes obtain are due to the incidental conventional melodrama with which the experienced popular author instinctively saves himself from failure. But what did you want? Owing to your unfortunate habit, you now, I hope, feel its inconvenience of not explaining yourself. I have had to discover this for myself. First, then, I have had to ask myself, what is a Don Juan? Vulgarly, a libertine. But your dislike of vulgarity is pushed to the length of a defect. Universality of character is impossible without a share of vulgarity. And even if you could acquire the taste, you would find yourself overfed from ordinary sauces without troubling me. So I took it that you demanded a Don Juan in the philosophic sense. Philosophically, Don Juan is a man who, though gifted enough to be exceptionally capable of distinguishing between good and evil, follows his own instincts without regard to the common statute or canon law, and therefore, whilst gaining the ardent sympathy of our rebellious instincts, which are flattered by the brilliancies with which Don Juan associates them, finds himself in mortal conflict with existing institutions, and defends himself by fraud and farce as unscrupulously as a farmer defends his crops by the same means against vermin. The prototypic Don Juan, invented early in the 16th century by a Spanish monk, was presented, according to the ideas of that time, as the enemy of God, the approach of whose vengeance is felt throughout the drama, growing in menace from minute to minute. No anxiety is caused on Don Juan's account by any minor antagonist. He easily eludes the police, temporal and spiritual, and when an indignant father seeks private redress with the sword, Don Juan kills him without an effort. Not until the slain father returns from heaven as the agent of God, in the form of his own statue, does he prevail against his slayer and cast him into hell. The moral is a monkish one. Repent and reform now, for tomorrow it may be too late. This is really the only point on which Don Juan is skeptical, for he is a devout believer in an ultimate hell and risks damnation only because, as he is young, it seems so far off that repentance can be postponed until he has amused himself to his heart's content. But the lesson intended by an author is hardly ever the lesson the world chooses to learn from his book. What attracts and impresses us in El Burlador de Sevilla is not the immediate urgency of repentance, but the heroism of daring to be the enemy of God. From Prometheus to my own devil's disciple, such enemies have always been popular. Don Juan became such a pet that the world could not bear his damnation. It reconciled him sentimentally to God in a second version, and clamored for his canonization for a whole century, thus treating him as English journalism has treated that comic foe of the gods, Punch. Molière's Don Juan casts back to the original in point of impenitence, but in piety he falls off greatly. True, he also proposes to repent, but in what terms? Oui, ma foi, il faut essaimenda. Encore vingt ou trente ans de cette vie, et puis nous songerons à nous. After Molière comes the artist enchanter, the master of masters, Mozart, who reveals the hero's spirit in magical harmonies, elfin tones, and elate darting rhythms, as of summer lightning made audible. Here you have freedom in love and in morality mocking exquisitely at slavery to them, and interesting you, attracting you, tempting you, inexplicably forcing you to range the hero with his enemy the statue on a transcendent plane, leaving the prudish daughter and her priggish lover on a crockery shelf below to live piously ever after. After these completed works, Byron's fragment does not count for much philosophically. Our vagabond libertines are no more interesting from that point of view than the sailor who has a wife in every pot, and Byron's hero is, after all, only a vagabond libertine, and he is dumb. He does not discuss himself with a Sganarelle Leporello, or with the fathers or brothers of his mistresses. He does not even, like Casanova, tell his own story. In fact, he is not a true Don Juan at all, for he is no more an enemy of God than any romantic and adventurous young sower of wild oats. Had you and I been in his place at his age, who knows whether we might not have done as he did, unless indeed your fastidiousness had saved you from the Empress Catherine. Byron was as little of a philosopher as Peter the Great. Both were instances of that rare and useful but unedifying variation, an energetic genius born without the prejudices or superstitions of his contemporaries. The resultant unscrupulous freedom of thought made Byron a greater poet than Wordsworth, just as it made Peter a greater king than George Roman III. But as it was, after all, only a negative qualification, it did not prevent Peter from being an appalling blackguard and an errant poltroon, nor did it enable Byron to become a religious foss like Shelley. Let us, then, leave Byron's Don Juan out of account. Mozart's is the last of the true Don Juans, for by the time he was of age, his cousin Faust had, in the hands of Goethe, taken his place and carried both his warfare and his reconciliation with the gods far beyond mere love-making into politics, high art, schemes for reclaiming new continents from the ocean, and recognition of an eternal, womanly principle in the universe. Goethe's Faust and Mozart's Don Juan were the last words of the 18th century on the subject, and by the time the polite critics of the 19th century, ignoring William Blake as superficially as the 18th had ignored Hogarth, or the 17th Bunyan, had got past the Dickens-Macaulay Dumas Guizot stage and the Stendhal-Meredith Turgenev stage, and were confronted with philosophic fiction by such pens as Ibsen's and Tolstoy's. Don Juan had changed his sex and become Doña Juana, breaking out of the doll's house and asserting herself as an individual instead of a mere item in a moral pageant. Now, it is all very well for you at the beginning of the 20th century to ask me for a Don Juan play, but you will see from the foregoing survey that Don Juan is a full century out of date for you and for me. And if there are millions of less literate people who are still in the 18th century, have they not Molière and Mozart, upon whose art no human hand can improve? You would laugh at me if at this time of day I dealt in jewels and ghosts and womanly women. As to mere libertinism, you would be the first to remind me that the Festin de Pierre of Molière is not a play for amourists, and that one bar of the voluptuous sentimentality of Gounod or Bizet would appear as a licentious stain on the score of Don Giovanni. Even the more abstract parts of the Don Juan play are dilapidated past use. For instance, Don Juan's supernatural antagonist hurled those who refused to repent into lakes of burning brimstone, there to be tormented by devils with horns and tails. Of that antagonist, and of that conception of repentance, how much is left that could be used in a play by me dedicated to you? On the other hand, those fosses of middle-class public opinion which hardly existed for a Spanish nobleman in the days of the first Don Juan are now triumphant everywhere. Civilized society is one huge bourgeoisie. No nobleman dares now shock his greengrocer. The women, Marchesane, Principes, Cameriere, Citadine, and all, are become equally dangerous. The sex is aggressive, powerful. When women are wronged, they do not group themselves pathetically to sing, Protger, il gesto silo. They grasp formidable legal and social weapons and retaliate. Political parties are wrecked and public careers undone by a single indiscretion. A man had better have all the statues in London to supper with him, ugly as they are, than be brought to the bar of the nonconformist conscience by Donna Elvira. Excommunication has become almost as serious a business as it was in the 10th century. As a result, man is no longer, like Don Juan, victor in the duel of sex. Whether he has ever really been may be doubted. At all events, the enormous superiority of woman's natural position in this matter is telling with greater and greater force. As to pulling the nonconformist conscience by the beard, as Don Juan plucked the beard of the commandant's statue in the convent of San Francisco, that is out of the question nowadays. Prudence and good manners alike forbid it to a hero with any mind. Besides, it is Don Juan's own beard that is in danger of plucking. Far from relapsing into hypocrisy, as Escanarel feared, he has unexpectedly discovered a moral in his immorality. The growing recognition of his new point of view is heaping responsibility on him. His former jests he has had to take as seriously as I have had to take some of the jests of Mr. W. S. Gilbert. His skepticism, once his least tolerated quality, has now triumphed so completely that he can no longer assert himself by witty negations, and must, to save himself from cipherdom, find an affirmative position. His 1,003 affairs of gallantry, after becoming, at most, 2 immature intrigues leading to sordid and prolonged complications and humiliations, have been discarded altogether as unworthy of his philosophic dignity and compromising to his newly acknowledged position as the founder of a school. Instead of pretending to read Ovid, he does actually read Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, studies Westermarck, and is concerned for the future of the race instead of for the freedom of his own instincts. Thus his profligacy and his daredevil airs have gone the way of his sword and mandolin into the rag shop of anachronisms and superstitions. In fact, he is now more Hamlet than Don Juan. For though the lines put into the actor's mouth to indicate to the pit that Hamlet is a philosopher are for the most part mere harmonious platitude, which, with a little debasement of the word music, would be proper to Pecksniff, yet if you separate the real hero, inarticulate and unintelligible to himself, except in flashes of inspiration, from the performer who has to talk at any cost through 5 acts, and if you also do what you must always do in Shakespeare's tragedies, that is, dissect out the absurd sensational incidents and physical violences of the borrowed story from the genuine Shakespearean tissue, you will get a true Promethean foe of the gods, whose instinctive attitude towards women much resembles that to which Don Juan is now driven. From this point of view, Hamlet was a developed Don Juan, whom Shakespeare palmed off as a reputable man, just as he palmed poor Macbeth off as a murderer. Today, the palming off is no longer necessary, at least on your plane and mine, because Don Juanism is no longer misunderstood as mere Casanovism. Don Juan himself is almost ascetic in his desire to avoid that misunderstanding. And so, my attempt to bring him up to date by launching him as a modern Englishman into a modern English environment has produced a figure superficially quite unlike the hero of Mozart. And yet, I have not the heart to disappoint you wholly of another glimpse of the Mozartian Dissoluto Punito and his antagonist, the statue. I feel sure you would like to know more of that statue, to draw him out when he is off duty, so to speak. To gratify you, I have resorted to the trick of the strolling theatrical manager who advertises the pantomime of Sinbad the Sailor with a stock of second-hand picture posters designed for Ali Baba. He simply thrusts a few oil jars into the Valley of Diamonds, and so fulfills the promise held out by the hoardings to the public eye. I have adapted this simple device to our occasion by thrusting into my perfectly modern 3-act play a totally extraneous act in which my hero, enchanted by the air of the Sierra, has a dream in which his Mozartian ancestor appears and philosophizes at great length in a Shaviosocratic dialogue with the lady, the statue, and the devil. But this pleasantry is not the essence of the play. Over this essence I have no control. You propound a certain social substance, sexual attraction to wit, for dramatic distillation, and I distill it for you. I do not adulterate the product with aphrodisiacs, nor dilute it with romance and water, for I am merely executing your commission, not producing a popular play for the market. You must therefore, unless, like most wise men, You read the play first and the preface afterwards. Prepare yourself to face a trumpery story of modern London life, a life in which, as you know, the ordinary man's main business is to get means to keep up the position and habits of a gentleman, and the ordinary woman's business is to get married. In 9,999 cases out of 10,000, you can count on their doing nothing, whether noble or base, that conflicts with these ends. And that assurance is what you rely on as their religion, their morality, their principles, their patriotism, their reputation, their honor, and so forth. On the whole, this is a sensible and satisfactory foundation for society. Money means nourishment and marriage means children, and that men should put nourishment first and women children first is, broadly speaking, the law of nature and not the dictate of personal ambition. The secret of the prosaic man's success, such as it is the simplicity with which he pursues these ends. The secret of the artistic man's failure, such as that is the versatility with which he strays in all directions after secondary ideals. The artist is either a poet or a scalawag. As poet, he cannot see, as the prosaic man does, that chivalry is at bottom only romantic suicide. As scalawag, he cannot see that it does not pay to sponge and beg and lie and brag, and neglect his person. Therefore do not misunderstand my plain statement of the fundamental constitution of London society as an Irishman's reproach to your nation. From the day I first set foot on this foreign soil, I knew the value of the prosaic qualities of which Irishmen teach Englishmen to be ashamed, as well as I knew the vanity of the poetic qualities of which Englishmen teach Irishmen to be proud. For the Irishman instinctively disparages the quality which makes the Englishman dangerous to him, and the Englishman instinctively flatters the fault that makes the Irishman harmless and amusing to him. What is wrong with the prosaic Englishman is what is wrong with the prosaic men of all countries. Stupidity, the vitality which places nourishment and children first, heaven and hell a somewhat remote second, and the health of society as an organic whole nowhere, may muddle successfully through the comparatively tribal stages of gregariousness. But in 19th century nations and 20th century empires, the determination of every man to be rich at all costs, and of every woman to be married at all costs, must, without a highly scientific social organization, produce a ruinous development of poverty, celibacy, prostitution, infant mortality, adult degeneracy, and everything that wise men most dread. In short, there is no future for men, however brimming with crude vitality, who are neither intelligent nor politically educated enough to be socialists. So do not misunderstand me in the other direction either. If I appreciate the vital qualities of the Englishman, as I appreciate the vital qualities of the bee, I do not guarantee the Englishman against being, like the bee or the Canaanite, smoked out and unloaded of his honey by beings inferior to himself in simple acquisitiveness, combativeness, and fecundity, but superior to him in imagination and cunning. The Don Juan play, however, is to deal with sexual attraction, and not with nutrition, and to deal with it in a society in which the serious business of sex is left by men to women, as the serious business of nutrition is left by women to men. That the men, to protect themselves against a too aggressive prosecution of the women's business, have set up a feeble romantic convention that the initiative in sex business must always come from the man, is true, but the pretense is so shallow that even in the theatre, that lost sanctuary of unreality, it imposes only on the inexperienced. In Shakespeare's plays, the woman always takes the initiative. In his problem plays and his popular plays alike, the love interest is the interest of seeing the woman hunt the man down. She may do it by blandishment, like Rosalind, or by stratagem, like Mariana, but in every case the relation between the woman and the man is the same. She is the pursuer and contriver, he the pursued and disposed of. When she is baffled, like Ophelia, she goes mad and commits suicide, and the man goes straight from her funeral to a fencing match. No doubt nature, with very young creatures, may save the woman the trouble of scheming. Prospero knows that he has only to throw Ferdinand and Miranda together, and they will mate like a pair of doves. And there is no need for Perdita to capture Florizel as the lady doctor in All's Well That Ends Well, an early Ibsenite heroine, captures Bertram. But the mature cases all illustrate the Shakespearean law. The one apparent exception, Petruchio, is not a real one. He is most carefully characterized as a purely commercial matrimonial adventurer. Once he is assured that Catherine has money, he undertakes to marry her before he has seen her. In real life, we find not only Petruchios, but Mantellanis and Dobbins who pursue women with appeals to their pity or jealousy or vanity, or cling to them in a romantically infatuated way. Such effeminates do not count in the world's scheme. Even Bunsby dropping like a fascinated bird into the jaws of Mrs. Maxtinger is by comparison a true tragic object of pity and terror. I find in my own plays that woman, projecting herself dramatically by my hands, a process over which I assure you I have no more real control than I have over my wife, behaves just as woman did in the plays of Shakespeare. And so your Don Juan has come to birth as a stage projection of the tragicomic love chase of the man by the woman, and my Don Juan is the quarry instead of the huntsman. Yet he is a true Don Juan, with a sense of reality that disables convention, defying to the last the fate which finally overtakes him. The woman's need of him to enable her to carry on nature's most urgent work does not prevail against him until his resistance gathers her energy to a climax at which she dares to throw away her customary exploitations of the conventional affectionate and dutiful poses and claim him by natural right for a purpose that far transcends their mortal personal purposes. Among the friends to whom I have read this play in manuscript are some of our own sex who are shocked at the unscrupulousness, meaning the total disregard of masculine fastidiousness with which the woman pursues her purpose. It does not occur to them that if women were as fastidious as men, morally or physically, there would be an end of the race. Is there anything meaner, then, to throw necessary work upon other people and then disparage it as unworthy and indelicate? We laugh at the haughty American nation because it makes the Negro clean its boots and then proves the moral and physical inferiority of the Negro by the fact that he is a shoeblack. But we ourselves throw the whole drudgery of creation on one sex, and then imply that no female of any womanliness or delicacy would initiate any effort in that direction. There are no limits to male hypocrisy in this matter. No doubt there are moments when man's sexual immunities are made acutely humiliating to him. When the terrible moment of birth arrives, its supreme importance and its superhuman effort and peril, in which the father has no part, dwarf him into the meanest insignificance. He slinks out of the way of the humblest petticoat, happy if he be poor enough to be pushed out of the house to outface his ignominy by drunken rejoicings. But when the crisis is over, he takes his revenge, swaggering as the breadwinner, and speaking of woman's sphere with condescension, even with chivalry, as if the kitchen and the nursery were less important than the office in the city. When his swagger is exhausted, he drivels into erotic poetry or sentimental uxoriousness, and the Tennysonian king, Arthur posing as Guinevere, becomes Don Quixote groveling before Dulcinea. You must admit that here nature beats comedy out of the field. The wildest hominist or feminist farce is insipid after the most commonplace slice of life. The pretense that women do not take the initiative is part of the farce. Why, the whole world is strewn with snares, traps, gins, and pitfalls for the capture of men by women. Give women the vote, and in 5 years there will be a crushing tax on bachelors. Men, on the other hand, attach penalties to marriage, depriving women of property, of the franchise, of the free use of their limbs, of that ancient symbol of immortality, the right to make oneself at home in the house of God by taking off the hat, of everything that he can force woman to dispense with without compelling himself to dispense with her. All in vain. Woman must marry because the race must perish without her travail. If the risk of death and the certainty of pain, danger and unutterable discomforts cannot deter her, slavery and swaddled ankles will not. And yet we assume that the farce that carries women through all these perils and hardships stops abashed before the primnesses of our behavior for young ladies. It is assumed that the woman must wait, motionless, until she is wooed. Nay, she often does wait motionless. That is how the spider waits for the fly. But the spider spins her web. And if the fly, like my hero, shows a strength that promises to extricate him, how swiftly does she abandon her pretense of passiveness and openly fling coil after coil about him until he is secured forever. If the really impressive books and other artworks of the world were produced by ordinary men, they would express more fear of women's pursuit than love of their illusory beauty. But ordinary men cannot produce really impressive artworks. Those who can are men of genius, that is, men selected by nature to carry on the work of building up an intellectual consciousness of her own instinctive purpose. Accordingly, we observe in the man of genius all the unscrupulousness and all the self-sacrifice, The two things are the same of woman. He will risk the stake and the cross, starve, when necessary, in a garret all his life, study women and live on their work and care as Darwin studied worms and lived upon sheep, work his nerves into rags without payment, a sublime altruist in his disregard of himself, an atrocious egotist in his disregard of others. Here woman meets a purpose as impersonal, as irresistible as her own, and the clash is sometimes tragic. When it is complicated by the genius being a woman, then the game is one for a king of critics. Your George Sand becomes a mother to gain experience for the novelist and to develop her, and gobbles up men of genius, Chopins, Mussetts, and the like, as mere hors d'oeuvres. I state the extreme case, of course, but what is true of the great man who incarnates the philosophic consciousness of life and the woman who incarnates its fecundity is true in some degree of all geniuses and all women. Hence it is that the world's books get written, its pictures painted, its statues modeled, its symphonies composed, by people who are free of the otherwise universal dominion of the tyranny of sex. Which leads us to the conclusion, astonishing to the vulgar, that art, instead of being before all things the expression of the normal sexual situation, is really the only department in which sex is a superseded and secondary power, with its consciousness so confused and its purpose so perverted that its ideas are mere fantasy to common men. Whether the artist becomes poet or philosopher, moralist or founder of a religion, his sexual doctrine is nothing but a barren special pleading for pleasure, excitement, and knowledge when he is young, and for contemplative tranquility when he is old and satiated. Romance and asceticism, amorism and puritanism are equally unreal in the great Philistine world. The world shown us in books, whether the books be confessed epics or professed gospels, or in codes, or in political orations, or in philosophic systems, is not the main world at all. It is only the self-consciousness of certain abnormal people who have the specific artistic talent and temperament. A serious matter this for you and me, because the man whose consciousness does not correspond to that of the majority is a madman, and the old habit of worshipping madmen is giving way to the new habit of locking them up. And since what we call education and culture is for the most part nothing but the substitution of reading for experience, of literature for life, of the obsolete fictitious for the contemporary real, education, as you no doubt observed at Oxford, destroys, by supplantation, every mind that is not strong enough to see through the imposture, and to use the great masters of arts as what they really are and no more. That is, patentees of highly questionable methods of thinking, and manufacturers of highly questionable, and for the majority but half-valid representations of life. The schoolboy who uses his Homer to throw at his fellow's head makes perhaps the safest and most rational use of him, and I observe with reassurance that you occasionally do the same, in your prime, with your Aristotle. Fortunately for us, whose minds have been so overwhelmingly sophisticated by literature, what produces all these treatises and poems and scriptures of one sort or another is the struggle of life to become divinely conscious of itself, instead of blindly stumbling hither and thither in the line of least resistance. Hence there is a driving towards truth in all books on matters where the writer, though exceptionally gifted, is nominally constituted, and has no private axe to grind. Copernicus had no motive for misleading his fellowmen as to the place of the sun in the solar system. He looked for it as honestly as a shepherd seeks his path in a mist. But Copernicus would not have written love stories scientifically. When it comes to sex relations, the man of genius does not share the common man's danger of capture, nor the woman of genius the common woman's overwhelming specialization. And that is why our scriptures and other art works, when they deal with love, turn from honest attempts at science in physics to romantic nonsense, erotic ecstasy, or the stern asceticism of satiety. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom, said William Blake. For you never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough. There is a political aspect of this sex question which is too big for my comedy, and too momentous to be passed over without culpable frivolity. It is impossible to demonstrate that the initiative in sex transactions remains with woman, and has been confirmed to her, so far, more and more by the suppression of rapine and discouragement of importunity, without being driven to very serious reflections on the fact that this initiative is politically the most important of all the initiatives, because our political experiment of democracy, the lost refuge of cheap misgovernment, will ruin us if our citizens are ill-bred. When we too were born, this country was still dominated by a selected class bred by political marriages. The commercial class had not then completed the first 25 years of its new share of political power, and it was itself selected by money qualification, and bred, if not by political marriage, at least by a pretty rigorous class marriage. Aristocracy and plutocracy still furnish the figureheads of politics, but they are now dependent on the votes of the promiscuously bred masses. And this, if you please, at the very moment when the political problem, having suddenly ceased to mean a very limited and occasional interference, mostly by way of jobbing public appointments, in the mismanagement of a tight but parochial little island, with occasional meaningless prosecution of dynastic wars, has become the industrial reorganization of Britain, the construction of a practically international commonwealth, and the partition of the whole of Africa, and perhaps the whole of Asia, by the civilized powers. Can you believe that the people whose conceptions of society and conduct, whose power of attention and scope of interest, are measured by the British theatre as you know it today, can either handle this colossal task themselves, or understand and support the sort of mind and character that is, at least comparatively, capable of handling it? For remember, what our voters are in the pit and gallery, they are also in the polling booth. We are all now under what Burke called the hoofs of the swinish multitude. Burke's language gave great offense because the implied exceptions to its universal application made it a class insult, and it certainly was not for the pot to call the kettle black. The aristocracy he defended, in spite of the political marriages by which it tried to secure breeding for itself, had its mind undertrained by silly schoolmasters and governesses, its character corrupted by gratuitous luxury, its self-respect adulterated to complete spuriousness by flattery and flunkeyism. It is no better today, and never will be any better. Our very peasants have something morally haughtier in them that culminates occasionally in a Bunyan, a Burns, or a Carlyle. But observe, this aristocracy, which was overpowered from 1832 to 1885 by the middle class, has come back to power by the votes of the swinish multitude. Tom Paine has triumphed over Edmund Burke, and the swine are now courted electors. How many of their own class have these electors sent to Parliament? Hardly a dozen out of 670, and these only under the persuasion of conspicuous personal qualifications and popular eloquence. The multitude thus pronounces judgment on its own units. It admits itself unfit to govern, and will vote only for a man morphologically and generically transfigured by palatial residence and equipage, by transcendent tailoring, by the glamour of aristocratic kinship. Well, we too know these transfigured persons, these college passmen, these well-groomed monocular algies and bobbies, these cricketers to whom age brings golf instead of wisdom, these plutocratic products of the nail and saucepan business as he got his money by. Do you know whether to laugh or cry at the notion that they, poor devils, will drive a team of continents as they drive a four-in-hand, turn a jostling anarchy of casual trade and speculation into an ordered productivity, and federate our colonies into a world power of the first magnitude? Give these people the most perfect political constitution and the soundest political program that benevolent omniscience can devise for them, and they will interpret it into mere fashionable folly or canting charity, as infallibly as a savage converts the philosophical theology of a Scotch missionary into crude African idolatry. I do not know whether you have any illusions left on the subject of education, progress, and so forth. I have none. Any pamphleteer can show the way to better things, but when there is no will there is no way. My nurse was fond of remarking that you cannot make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, and the more I see of the efforts of our churches and universities and literary sages to raise the mass above its own level, the more convinced I am that my nurse was right. Progress can do nothing but make the most of us all as we are, and that most would clearly not be enough, even if those who are already raised out of the lowest abysses would allow the others a chance. The bubble of heredity has been pricked. The certainty that acquirements are negligible as elements in practical heredity has demolished the hopes of the educationists as well as the terrors of the degeneracy mongers, and we know now that there is no hereditary governing class, any more than a hereditary hooliganism. We must either breed political capacity or be ruined by democracy, which was forced on us by the failure of the older alternatives. Yet if despotism failed only for want of a capable, benevolent despot, What chance has democracy, which requires a whole population of capable voters? That is, of political critics who, if they cannot govern in person for lack of spare energy or specific talent for administration, can at least recognize and appreciate capacity and benevolence in others, and so govern through capably benevolent representatives? Where are such voters to be found today? Nowhere. Promiscuous breeding has produced a weakness of character that is too timid to face the full stringency of a thoroughly competitive struggle for existence and too lazy and petty to organize the Commonwealth cooperatively. Being cowards, we defeat natural selection under cover of philanthropy. Being sluggards, we neglect artificial selection under cover of delicacy and morality. Yet we must get an electorate of capable critics or collapse as Rome and Egypt collapsed. At this moment, the Roman decadent phase of panem et circenses is being inaugurated under our eyes. Our newspapers and melodramas are blustering about our imperial destiny, but our eyes and hearts turn eagerly to the American millionaire. As his hand goes down to his pocket, our fingers go up to the brims of our hats by instinct. Our ideal prosperity is not the prosperity of the industrial North, but the prosperity of the Isle of Wight, of Folkestone and Ramsgate, of Nice and Monte Carlo. That is the only prosperity you see on the stage, where the workers are all footmen, parlourmaids, comic lodging letters, and fashionable professional men, whilst the heroes and heroines are miraculously provided with unlimited dividends and eat gratuitously, like the knights in Don Quixote's books of chivalry. The city papers prate of the competition of Bombay with Manchester and the like. The real competition is the competition of Regent Street with the Rue de Rivoli, of Brighton and the South Coast with the Riviera, for the spending money of the American trusts. What is all this growing love of pageantry, this effusive loyalty, this officious rising and uncovering at a wave from a flag or a blast from a brass band? Imperialism, not a bit of it. Obsequiousness, servility, cupidity roused by the prevailing smell of money. When Mr. Carnegie rattled his millions in his pockets, all England became one rapacious cringe. Only, when Rhodes, who had probably been reading my Socialism for Millionaires, left word that no idler was to inherit his estate, the bent backs straightened mistrustfully for a moment. Could it be that the Diamond King was no gentleman after all? However, it was easy to ignore a rich man's solcism. The ungentlemanly clause was not mentioned again, and the backs soon bowed themselves back into their natural shape. But I hear you asking me in alarm whether I have actually put all this tub thumping into a Don Juan comedy. I have not. I have only made my Don Juan a political pamphleteer and given you his pamphlet in full by way of appendix. You will find it at the end of the book. I am sorry to say that it is a common practice with romances to announce their hero as a man of extraordinary genius, and to leave his works entirely to the reader's imagination, so that at the end of the book, you whisper to yourself ruefully that but for the author's solemn preliminary assurance, you should hardly have given the gentleman credit for ordinary good sense. You cannot accuse me of this pitiable barrenness, this feeble evasion. I not only tell you that my hero wrote a revolutionist's handbook. I give you the handbook at full length for your edification if you care to read it. And in that handbook, you will find the politics of the sex question as I conceive Don Juan's descendant to understand them. Not that I disclaim the fullest responsibility for his opinions, and for those of all my characters, pleasant and unpleasant. They are all right from their several points of view, and their points of view are, for the dramatic moment, mine also. This may puzzle the people who believe that there is such a thing as an absolutely right point of view, usually their own. It may seem to them that nobody who doubts this can be in a state of grace. However that may be, it is certainly true that nobody who agrees with them can possibly be a dramatist, or indeed anything else that turns upon a knowledge of mankind. Hence it has been pointed out that Shakespeare had no conscience. Neither have I. In that sense, you may, however, remind me that this digression of mine into politics was preceded by a very convincing demonstration that the artist never catches the point of view of the common man on the question of sex, because he is not in the same predicament. I first prove that anything I write on the relation of the sexes is sure to be misleading, and then I proceed to write a Don Juan play. Well, if you insist on asking me why I behave in this absurd way, I can only reply that you ask me to, and that in any case my treatment of the subject may be valid for the artist, amusing to the amateur, and at least intelligible and therefore possibly suggestive to the Philistine. Every man who records his illusions is providing data for the genuinely scientific psychology, which the world still waits for. I plank down my view of the existing relations of men to women in the most highly civilized society for what it is worth. It is a view like any other view and no more, neither true nor false, but, I hope, a way of looking at the subject which throws into the familiar order of cause and effect a sufficient body of fact and experience to be interesting to you, if not to the playgoing public of London. I have certainly shown little consideration for that public in this enterprise, but I know that it has the friendliest disposition towards you and me, as far as it has any consciousness of our existence, and quite understands that what I write for you must pass at a considerable height over its simple romantic head. It will take my books as read and my genius for granted, trusting me to put forth work of such quality as shall bear out its verdict. So we may disport ourselves on our own plane to the top of our bent, and if any gentleman points out that neither this epistle dedicatory nor the dream of Don Juan in the third act of the ensuing comedy is suitable for immediate production at a popular theatre, we need not contradict him. Napoleon provided Talma with a pit of kings, with what effect on Talma's acting is not recorded. As for me, what I have always wanted is a pit of philosophers, and this is a play for such a pit. I should make formal acknowledgment to the authors whom I have pillaged in the following pages, if I could recollect them all. The theft of the Brigand Poetaster from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is deliberate, and the metamorphosis of Leporello into Enri Straker, motor engineer and new man, is an intentional dramatic sketch for the contemporary embryo of Mr. H. G. Wells's anticipation of the efficient engineering class, which will, he hopes, finally sweep the jabberers out of the way of civilization. Mr. Barrio has also, whilst I am correcting my proofs, delighted London with a servant who knows more than his masters. The conception of Mendoza Limited I trace back to a certain West Indian colonial secretary, who, at a period when he and I and Mr. Sidney Webb were sowing our political wild oats as a sort of Fabian Three Musketeers, without any provision of the surprising respectability of the crop that followed, recommended Webb, the encyclopedic and inexhaustible, to form himself into a company for the benefit of the shareholders. Octavius I take over unaltered from Mozart, and I hereby authorize any actor who impersonates him to sing Dalla sua pace, if he can at any convenient moment during the representation. Anne was suggested to me by the 15th century Dutch morality called Everyman, which Mr. William Pole has lately resuscitated so triumphantly. I trust he will work that vein further, and recognize that Elizabethan Renaissance fustian is no more bearable after medieval Poesy than scribe after Ibsen. As I sat watching Everyman at the Charterhouse, I said to myself, why not every woman? Anne was the result. Every woman is not Anne, but Anne is every woman. That the author of Everyman was no mere artist, but an artist-philosopher, and that the artist-philosophers are the only sort of artists I take quite seriously, will be no news to you. Even Plato and Boswell, as the dramatists who invented Socrates and Dr. Johnson, impress me more deeply than the romantic playwrights. Ever since, as a boy, I first breathed the air of the transcendental regions at a performance of Mozart's Zauberflöte, I have been proof against the garish splendors and alcoholic excitements of the ordinary stage combinations of tapetitian romance with the police intelligence. Bunyan, Blake, Hogarth, and Turner, these four apart and above all the English classics, Goethe, Shelley, Schopenhauer, Wagner, Ibsen, Morris, Tolstoy, and Nietzsche are among the writers whose peculiar sense of the world I recognize as more or less akin to my own. Mark the word peculiar. I read Dickens and Shakespeare without shame or stint, but their pregnant observations and demonstrations of life are not coordinated into any philosophy or religion. On the contrary, Dickens's sentimental assumptions are violently contradicted by his observations, and Shakespeare's pessimism is only his wounded humanity. Both have the specific genius of the fictionist and the common sympathies of human feeling and thought in preeminent degree. They are often saner and shrewder than the philosophers, just as Sancho Panza was often saner and shrewder than Don Quixote. They clear away vast masses of oppressive gravity by their sense of the ridiculous, which is at bottom a combination of sound moral judgment with light-hearted good humor. But they are concerned with the diversities of the world instead of with its unities. They are so irreligious that they exploit popular religion for professional purposes without delicacy or scruple, For example, Sidney Cotton and the ghost in Hamlet. They are anarchical, and cannot balance their exposures of Angelo and Dogberry, Sir Leicester Dedlock and Mr. Tite Barnacle, with any portrait of a prophet or a worthy leader. They have no constructive ideas. They regard those who have them as dangerous fanatics. In all their fictions, there is no leading thought or inspiration for which any man could conceivably risk the spoiling of his hat in a shower, much less his life. Both are alike forced to borrow motives for the more strenuous actions of their personages from the common stockpot of melodramatic plots, so that Hamlet has to be stimulated by the prejudices of a policeman and Macbeth by the cupidities of a bushranger. Dickens, without the excuse of having to manufacture motives for Hamlets and Macbeths, superfluously punt his crew down the stream of his monthly pots by mechanical devices, which I leave you to describe. My own memory being quite baffled by the simplest question as to monks in Oliver Twist. Are the long-lost parentage of Smike? Are the relations between the Dorrit and Clenham families so inopportunely discovered by Monsieur Regard Blandois? The truth is, the world was to Shakespeare a great stage of fools, on which he was utterly bewildered. He could see no sort of sense in living at all, and Dickens saved himself from the despair of the dream in The Chimes by taking the world for granted and busying himself with its details. Neither of them could do anything with a serious positive character. They could place a human figure before you with perfect verisimilitude, but when the moment came for making it live and move, they found, unless it made them laugh, that they had a puppet on their hands and had to invent some artificial external stimulus to make it work. This is what is the matter with Hamlet all through. He has no will except in his bursts of temper. Foolish bawdelators make a virtue of this after their fashion. They declare that the play is the tragedy of irresolution. But all Shakespeare's projections of the deepest humanity he knew have the same defect. Their characters and manners are lifelike, but their actions are forced on them from without, and the external force is grotesquely inappropriate, except when it is quite conventional, as in the case of Henry V. Falstaff, is more vivid than any of these serious reflective characters, because he is self-acting. His motives are his own appetites and instincts and humors. Richard Roman III, too, is delightful as the whimsical comedian who stops a funeral to make love to the corpse's widow. But when, in the next act, he is replaced by a stage villain who smothers babies and offs with people's heads, we are revolted at the imposture and repudiate the changeling. Falconbridge, Coriolanus, Leonce are admirable descriptions of instinctive temperaments. Indeed, the play of Coriolanus is the greatest of Shakespeare's comedies, but description is not philosophy, and comedy neither compromises the author nor reveals him. He must be judged by those characters into which he puts what he knows of himself, his Hamlets and Macbeths and Lears and Prosperos. If these characters are agonizing in a void about factitious melodramatic murders and revenges, and the like, whilst the comic characters walk with their feet on solid ground, vivid and amusing, you know that the author has much to show and nothing to teach. The comparison between Falstaff and Prospero is like the comparison between Micawber and David Copperfield. At the end of the book, you know Micawber, whereas you only know what has happened to David, and are not interested enough in him to wonder what his politics or religion might be if anything so stupendous as a religious or political idea, or a general idea of any sort, were to occur to him. He is tolerable as a child, but he never becomes a man, and might be left out of his own biography altogether, but for his usefulness as a stage confidant. A Horatio, or Charles his friend, what they call on the stage a feeder. Now you cannot say this of the works of the artist philosophers. You cannot say it, for instance, of the Pilgrim's Progress. Put your Shakespearean hero and coward, Henry V. and Pistol or Perils, beside Mr. Valiant and Mr. Fearing, and you have a sudden revelation of the abyss that lies between the fashionable author who could see nothing in the world but personal aims and the tragedy of their disappointment, or the comedy of their incongruity, and the field preacher who achieved virtue and courage by identifying himself with the purpose of the world as he understood it. The contrast is enormous. Bunyan's coward stirs your blood more than Shakespeare's hero, who actually leaves you cold and secretly hostile. You suddenly see that Shakespeare, with all his flashes and divinations, never understood virtue and courage, never conceived how any man who was not a fool could, like Bunyan's hero, look back from the brink of the river of death over the strife and labor of his pilgrimage, and say, "Yet do I not repent me?" or, with the panache of a millionaire, bequeath my sod to him that shall succeed me in my pilgrimage, and my courage and skill to him that can get it. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being thoroughly won out before you are thrown on the scrap heap, the being a force of nature, instead of a feverish, selfish, little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. And also, the only real tragedy in life is the being used by personally minded men for purposes which you recognize to be base. All the rest is at worst mere misfortune or mortality. This alone is misery, slavery, hell on earth, and the revolt against it is the only force that offers a man's work to the poor artist, whom our personally minded rich people would so willingly employ as panda, buffoon, beauty-monger, sentimentalizer, and the like. It may seem a long step from Bunyan to Nietzsche, but the difference between their conclusions is purely formal. Bunyan's perception that righteousness is filthy rags, his scorn for Mr. Legality in the village of morality, his defiance of the church as the supplanter of religion, his insistence on courage as the virtue of virtues, his estimate of the career of the conventionally respectable and sensible worldly Weissman as no better at bottom than the life and death of Mr. Badman. All this, expressed by Bunyan in the terms of a tinker's theology, is what Nietzsche has expressed in terms of post-Darwinian, post-Schopenhauerian philosophy, Wagner in terms of polytheistic mythology, and Ibsen in terms of mid-19th century Parisian dramaturgy. Nothing is new in these matters except their novelties. For instance, it is a novelty to call justification by faith, will, and justification by works, Vorstellung. The sole use of the novelty is that you and I buy and read Schopenhauer's treatise on will and representation when we should not dream of buying a set of sermons on faith versus works. At bottom, the controversy is the same, and the dramatic results are the same. Bunyan makes no attempt to present his pilgrims as more sensible or better conducted than Mr. Worldly Weissman. Mr. W.W.'s worst enemies, as Mr. Embezzler, Mr. Never Go to Church on Sunday, Mr. Bad Form, Mr. Murderer, Mr. Burglar, Mr. Correspondent, Mr. Blackmailer, Mr. Cad, Mr. Drunkard, Mr. Labor Agitator, and so forth, can read the Pilgrim's Progress without finding a word said against them, whereas the respectable people who snub them and put them in prison, such as Mr. W.W. himself and his young friend Civility, formalist and hypocrisy, Wildhead, inconsiderate and pragmatic, who were clearly young university men of good family and high feeding, that brisk lad Ignorance, talkative, by ends of fair speech, and his mother-in-law Lady Feigning, and other reputable gentlemen and citizens, catch it very severely. Even little Faith, though he gets to heaven at last, is given to understand that it served him right to be mobbed by the brothers Faint Heart, Mistrust, and Guilt, all three recognized members of respectable society and veritable pillars of the law. The whole allegory is a consistent attack on morality and respectability, without a word that one can remember against vice and crime. Exactly what is complained of in Nietzsche and Ibsen, is it not? And also exactly what would be complained of in all the literature, which is great enough and old enough to have attained canonical rank, officially or unofficially, were it not that books are admitted to the canon by a compact which confesses their greatness in consideration of abrogating their meaning, so that the Reverend Rector can agree with the Prophet Micah as to his inspired style, without being committed to any complicity in Micah's furiously radical opinions. Why, even I, as I force myself, pen in hand, into recognition and civility, find all the force of my onslaught destroyed by a simple policy of non-resistance. In vain do I redouble the violence of the language in which I proclaim my heterodoxies. I rail at the theistic credulity of Voltaire, the amoristic superstition of Shelley, the revival of tribal soothsaying and idolatrous rites, which Huxley called science and mistook for an advance on the Pentateuch, no less than at the welter of ecclesiastical and professional humbug, which saves the face of the stupid system of violence and robbery, which we call law and industry. Even atheists reproach me with infidelity and anarchists with nihilism, because I cannot endure their moral tirades. And yet, instead of exclaiming, "Send this inconceivable Satanist to the stake," the respectable newspapers pith me by announcing another book by this brilliant and thoughtful writer. And the ordinary citizen, knowing that an author who is well spoken of by a respectable newspaper must be all right, reads me, as he reads Micah, with undisturbed edification from his own point of view. It is narrated that in the 1870s an old lady, a very devout Methodist, moved from Colchester to a house in the neighborhood of the City Road, in London, where, mistaking the Hall of Science for a chapel, she sat at the feet of Charles Bradlaugh for many years, entranced by his eloquence, without questioning his orthodoxy or molting a feather of her faith. I fear I small be defrauded of my just martyrdom in the same way. However, I am digressing, as a man with a grievance always does. And after all, the main thing in determining the artistic quality of a book is not the opinions it propagates, but the fact that the writer has opinions. The old lady from Colchester was right to sun her simple soul in the energetic radiance of Bradlaugh's genuine beliefs and disbeliefs, rather than in the chill of such mere painting of light and heat as elocution and convention can achieve. My contempt for Bell's letters, and for amateurs who become the heroes of the fanciers of literary virtuosity, is not founded on any illusion of mind as to the permanence of those forms of thought, call them opinions, by which I strive to communicate my bent to my fellows. To younger men they are already outmoded, for though they have no more lost their logic than an 18th-century pastel has lost its drawing or its color, yet, like the pastel, they grow indefinably shabby, and will grow shabbier until they cease to count at all, when my books will either perish, or, if the world is still poor enough to want them, will have to stand, with Bunyan's, by quite amorphous qualities of temper and energy. With this conviction I cannot be a belletrist. No doubt I must recognize, as even the ancient mariner did, that I must tell my story entertainingly, if I am to hold the wedding guests spellbound in spite of the siren sounds of the loud bassoon. But for aught's sake, alone, I would not face the toil of writing a single sentence. I know that there are men who, having nothing to say and nothing to write, are nevertheless so in love with oratory and with literature that they keep desperately repeating as much as they can understand of what others have said or written aforetime. I know that the leisurely tricks which their want of conviction leaves them free to play with the diluted and misapprehended message supply them with a pleasant parlor game which they call style. I can pity their dotage and even sympathize with their fancy. But a true original style is never achieved for its own sake. A man may pay from a shilling to a guinea, according to his means, to see, hear, or read another man's act of genius. But he will not pay with his whole life and soul to become a mere virtuoso in literature, exhibiting an accomplishment which will not even make money for him, like fiddle playing. Effectiveness of assertion is the alpha and omega of style. He who has nothing to assert has no style, and can have none. He who has something to assert will go as far in power of style as its momentousness and his conviction will carry him. Disprove his assertion after it is made, yet its style remains. Darwin has no more destroyed the style of Job, nor of Handel, than Martin Luther destroyed the style of Giotto. All the assertions get disproved sooner or later, and so we find the world full of a magnificent debris of artistic fossils, with the matter-of-fact credibility gone clean out of them, but the forms still splendid. And that is why the old masters play the deuce with our mere susceptibles. Your royal academician thinks he can get the style of Giotto, without Giotto's beliefs, and correct his perspective into the bargain. Your man of letters thinks he can get Bunyan's or Shakespeare's style, without Bunyan's conviction, or Shakespeare's apprehension, especially if he takes care not to split his infinitives. And so with your doctors of music, who, with their collections of discords duly prepared and resolved or retarded or anticipated in the manner of the great composers, think they can learn the art of Palestrina from Cherubim's treatise. All this academic art is far worse than the trade in sham antique furniture. For the man who sells me an oaken chest which he swears was made in the 18th century, though as a matter of fact he made it himself only yesterday, at least does not pretend that there are any modern ideas in it, whereas your academic copier of fossils offers them to you as the latest outpouring of the human spirit, and worst of all, kidnaps young people as pupils and persuades them that his limitations are rules, his observances dexterities, his timidities good taste, and his emptinesses purities. And when he declares that art should not be didactic, all the people who have nothing to teach, and all the people who don't want to learn agree with him emphatically. I pride myself on not being one of these susceptible. If you study the electric light with which I supply you, in that Bumbledonian public capacity of mine, over which you make merry from time to time, You will find that your house contains a great quantity of highly susceptible copper wire, which gouges itself with electricity and gives you no light whatever. But here and there occurs a scrap of intensely insusceptible, intensely resistant material, and that stubborn scrap grapples with the current and will not let it through until it has made itself useful to you as those two vital qualities of literature, light and heat. Now, if I am to be no mere copper wire amateur, but a luminous author, I must also be a most intensely refractory person, liable to go out and to go wrong at inconvenient moments, and with incendiary possibilities. These are the faults of my qualities, and I assure you that I sometimes dislike myself so much that when some irritable reviewer chances at that moment to pitch into me with zest, I feel unspeakably relieved and obliged. But I never dream of reforming, knowing that I must take myself as I am and get what work I can out of myself. All this you will understand, for there is community of material between us. We are both critics of life as well as of art, and you have perhaps said to yourself when I have passed your windows, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." An awful and chastening reflection, which shall be the closing cadence of this immoderately long letter from yours faithfully, G. Bernard Shaw. Woking, 1903. Dramatis Personae Roebuck, Ramsden, Paul Ahmade, Octavius Ramsden, John Tanner, Anne Whitefield, Mrs. Whitefield, Miss Ramsden, Violet Robinson, Henry Straker, Hector Malone, Mr. Malone, Mendoza, Anarchist Duval, Rowdy Social Democrat, Sulky Social Democrat, Gothard, and Officer.